Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find out more about what we do at officehours.global. Our second hour today is going to be talking about synthesizers. Karl Asmussen is here, and he's going to be walking us through some of those things. But we have a lot of good folks here ready to answer some good audio questions as well as general media questions. So let's go ahead and get ready to jump into these. Before we get started, one thing that I wanted to thank Courtney, because it's the first time he's been on. I really like the mic, Courtney. I copied Courtney. I just want to let give credit where credit's due. Stellar X2 is now I think it's going to be my. Mickey gave it the blessing of this is a good this is a good mic. So anyway, really happy with it. And also one thing that came up that I think we're going to try to bring somebody in to talk about, but you want to check out. I think you should check out. I put it into the general discussion in Discord is avae.io. It's called Canvas, and it just looks really interesting. I haven't used it yet. I downloaded it. It looks kind of like QLab, but with nodal processing. I can't quite figure out exactly all the things it does yet. But anyway, check it out. Canvas it's avae.io. And it'd be great for us to start thinking about it because I'm going to try to see if they'll come on and talk to us because it looks like a cool new app for audio. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into the questions. And Mitch, what do we got?
Thank you, Alex. First question in from John Snyder in Reno, Nevada. A common office hours colloquialism is buy once, cry once. How do you avoid buy once, cry for a very long time?
Go ahead, Jason.
First, I reject the premise of the question. A colloquialism is confined to a specific geographic area, and we are exactly the opposite. But no.
No, it's the geographical area is cyberspace. How long have it been since you heard that word? Cyberspace.
Cyberspace. That's right. The World Wide Web is
exactly
smoking.
That's our new space.
My answer though is pretty simple. Pace yourself. Don't over leverage yourself. Be responsible or responsibly irresponsible. We'll put it that way. And we will not ever, help you with being more irresponsible than you should be.
Go ahead, Courtney.
One word for you: eBay. Like new. Fill in the blank.
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, also, there is a secondary part of that can get you in a little bit of trouble. I mean, it is a reasonable thing if you can afford it and have a good use case for it to buy something that is proven, that is robust, that will last a long time. But we're also in an age of innovation. So I've seen that things that cost a lot of money, like microphone preamps in the old days, you could spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 on just this perfectly transparent microphone preamp. In the age of more sophisticated electronics, you can get large amounts of that performance at much lower cost now. So just be wary and pay attention to where it might be going in terms of technology.
There you go, Mickey.
Yeah, I'm taking this from the point of view as a business, and you have to, and these are, it's the ideas of assets versus liabilities is not something new. And in terms of acquiring assets, you have to think of it from the point of view of, will I generate revenue from this? And with that, you have to do the math. You have to think of how long it would take for you to recuperate the investment, and how long after that can you continually put this asset to use, and how much money in the long run for the lifespan of that asset will you be able to generate. And that makes you, instead of buying and then crying once or crying for a very long time, you actually know in your head that you have done the math and you have predicted that at this point in time it will actually make you money. It's not going to be painful. It's actually going to be a good thing for you.
You go, John.
Mickey said exactly what I was going to say. Mickey.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, Mickey's on target there. I mean, there are two aspects to buying anything. There's an emotional, I got to have it, it's shiny and cool and new, or the other part that Mickey just mentioned, that there's a business decision to be made. Ultimately, anything you buy is going to eventually disappoint because it either gets too old or it gets its life goes quickly. I agree that you have to see it from the standpoint of, did I make money with that? And if you did okay.
Go ahead, Jason.
Just to wrap it up, a lot of people on this panel do this for a living, and as such, our value proposition has to do with our answers. So our value prop had to do with the value of the thing. It's not just spend all this money because you've got no choice but to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me with Pixel Core for a long time, basically we always calculated into our we didn't do line item bids like we just did. This is what we're going to give you, but we always calculated the base rental cost that we would pay if we did it, and that was part of the bid. So we never gave away equipment, and so our equipment. Now, what we would do is usually discount it. Depending on the job, anywhere from 10 to 25% from what the market rate was for that hardware. The two advantages that the client got was, number one, is it was in pristine condition. We're the ones that own it. And number two, is a little less expensive, but not a lot. And again, why we did that is they said, well, we'll just rent it from somebody else if you're going to charge us for it. And we go, okay. And then we gave them the quote for that, and it was more, without a markup, to do it. They could go out and find it. So anyway, and then the rule that we had there was typically 1/3 and sometimes as much as 1/2 of that rental budget was just money that we could spend on hardware. And so a big job, we had jobs where the rental was $140,000, like it was, for an event. So I had anywhere from $50,000 to $70,000 to get new equipment, and we would buy the equipment, with that. But that rental, what we never did was take all of that rental and turn it into profit. We would always be reinvesting in either fixing the gear, managing the gear, buying new gear, and that's how you end up with a 10,000-foot warehouse full of gear. Then the problem really becomes that we didn't calculate the cost of the storage, which turned out to be a lot. But I would say that it saved us, owning the equipment, saved us on many projects where things went wrong. We spent into the project to make sure that it succeeded. I've always been, I'd rather lose money on a project than have it go sideways. And so we would lose money on everything except for the hardware. And then the hardware would save us because that big rental nut would come in, and it would keep us from going into the negatives. Go ahead, Mickey.
And yeah, every business has their own way of doing things, especially sending out the cost estimates or quotations. A lot of people like Alex like to do like a full package deal as opposed to having line items. But even if you do that, you should cost things out internally and how much this specific piece of equipment costs you to use. And you keep track of that so that you can tell that this piece of gear, even though it's part of a package, is actually making money or not making money, or how fast or how slow it is making money.
And, owning the gear also allowed us to do a lot of things. Like we just throw things at like, oh, I want to make this a better project. I'm going to send 2 more cameras out, and I wouldn't charge the client for that. I would just go, I'm going to send 2 more cameras. Or I feel like I want to do things to make the project better. And by having a huge amount of hardware around, I could just add capacity, at any point in time to make it a better project. I usually never told the client that. They just noticed that the show was better, because if we tell them that, then they want it all the time. So, I wouldn't say, oh, I'm bringing 2 more cameras in. They just noticed that there was more available, because I thought that it was better to have something there, that was like, I wanted to add a little bit of a twist to it. But that's also how we kept clients, because when they went to somebody else, the cliff between what we were doing and what they were doing was pretty steep. Next question.
Next question, coming in from Jacob Goodnight in Indianapolis, Indiana. Jacob asks, could you use iZotope RX voice denoise in Audio Hijack to produce a similar result to Noise Assist for much less cost? The voice denoise VST module is 0 latency and only $49 as part of the iZotope RX elements.
Go ahead, Jason.
Can you? Well, I've got to say it, Mickey. It depends on what you mean by similar. I would argue no. And still to this day, iZotope is best for post. And our iZotope RX is wonderful. But, comparing it to Noise Assist is a fool's errand.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, I think that Jason got that correct. It's a question of, you could probably run it. The question is it better? And it's not going to be better than a hardware solution. It's just going to be an approximation of it. I think I'd asked Mickey at one time, what would be a DSP box that I could plug in line with my mic and then run a filter or a plug-in on it. And I think we talked about a bunch of things, including the Lidar plug-in.
You go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah, iZotope voice denoise if it is run as a plugin with an audio hijack uses the CPU. Now these plugins in general are meant to be run within a DAW, which is capable of providing plugins with a buffer. So these plugins are expecting that buffer. So if you run it within a piece of software like Audio Hijack, which does not provide a buffer to the plugins, it's a hit or miss. It could work one day, it could not work another day.
Yeah, and I think Mickey's spot on there. And I think it'd be interesting for us to test, because I think there is an RX version that is designed for real time. But I'd be really interested to see how it interacts. And to what Mitchell said, we've owned a bunch of the Cedar DNS 2s. Those are the ones you'd put in line. They have 2 channels. You'll hit learn, and it'll learn, and then you kind of turn it down. I actually think that after using both of them for quite some time, that the noise assist plugin that Sound Devices has is at least as good and potentially better. So it doesn't remove as much noise all the time, but when you turn it up, it's much gentler than the Cedar. The Cedar will tend to start to become very, you start to hear the bits, as you turn it up, that you don't hear with the noise assist. But you can also get larger versions of the Cedar, and ones with more manual control. But there is the DNS 8 will do 8 channels independently. So you do send and receives out of a mixer. And so you can do a lot of individual things. When you mix that with Dugan Auto Mix for a round table, it's kind of magical. Next question.
Next question in from Vipin Abraham in Pune, India. Need recommendations for lapel mics to capture clean audio for a talking head video in a semi-treated indoor location. Would appreciate any additional tips. MixPre is outside my budget for the noise suppression.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Let me beat Mickey to it. It depends. It depends on what you're going to be plugging those microphones into. You said that MixPre is out of your price range. You got to be plugging these into some type of mixer, or maybe your camera has a microphone input. If it does, hopefully it is an XLR input. If they're XLR inputs, I'd recommend, it depends on your budget. This may put you over the price of a MixPre, but the Sanken COS 11 is very nice, 11D lavalier. It comes with an XLR end on it, or you can get it wired for wireless mics. But if you don't have wireless mics, that wouldn't be a choice for you. Another possibility is a Tram TR50, which that's old school. I have a bunch of these. They're great for punching through. They have a little peakier high end on them, so if you're going to hide the microphone, put it inside a tie or underneath a layer of cloth, it can preserve your high frequency response and still remain invisible. So the TR50, it has the vampire clip that it can go into. It can mount clandestinely on an undershirt or inside a lapel very easily. So those would be my 2 recommendations. There's lots of cheaper Chinese lavaliers that are on the market that terminate in the 3.5 millimeter plug. So if that's there's plenty of those you can find. Some of them sound okay, some of them don't.
Go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah, I would second the Sanken COS 11. Those are our workhorse lavaliers. They're relatively durable, sound great. You can get them wired for with an XLR power supply. So you do not, since it's just a talking head, you could save on the expense of a wireless system. Aside from the COS 11D, I would also recommend the if you're a bit more on the budget, the Countryman B3s.
And sorry, I was researching while we were talking, and I can't. Let's see.
Bill is up.
Bill.
Yeah, I think it's me. When I was shooting actively in the field a lot, I carried 2 wired lavs with me, both from Sony, an ECM77B and an ECM44. And I would reach for the one in the circumstance that I found myself in, depending on how much background noise I was fighting. The 77 was much more transparent, had much better reach, but if I was in a noisy environment, that fought against it. So that's why I carried the 44s. It's a larger capsule, but it is less sensitive. So if I could mount it correctly on somebody, I would get more of them and less of the room, which really worked against things like those echoey locations and gave me better sound there. So that's kind of one of the reasons that we pick particular kinds of mics. You know, the one mic that is beautiful when you're outside in a lovely environment and you want that person that you're shooting to sound very much similar to the boom overhead on a lav, that's when the 77 with more transparency and reach was a good choice. But in a noisy environment, the 44 was a better choice. So that's kind of the thing that I used to think about.
Next question.
Next question is coming from me. What is the very best real-time audio noise reduction system available under 2K?
John.
I think this is a bit of a dead horse at this point, but the MixPre 6 with noise assist, I think, is going to be your best bet.
Yeah.
Considering I think the Cedar stuff comes in around 2,200 for the 2-channel.
I think it's at least 2,200. When I'm a little bitter because when I bought it was a lot more than that. Go ahead, Mickey.
I'd probably go with the Apollo Twin with the C-Suite plugin. If you're using it, what you need is an audio interface. Now, if you need a field recorder, then that's when I would go with the MixPre.
Go ahead, Carl.
So if you're doing records, then I would not be doing. But if you're doing real time, then I would get rid of the noise. So recording studios don't have noise suppression; they just don't have noise. So have your space have no noise. Figure out what is causing noise, and so lights can have no fan mode, turn the aircon off, all those kind of things. So most professional equipment does have a no sound mode to it. Sometimes it can only run for 2 to 3 minutes before you have to turn the fan back on. But other than that, but there's a lot of sets out there that can't have noise. The only one I'm kind of interested in is maybe the volume used for the Mandalorian, because those panels have fans. And they have it's probably 4,000 fans going in a circle there. So I'd be interested to know if they do any, actual sound on that stage, or if it's all ADR. So I know everything's in a helmet, so there's another reason.
And I would say that you can almost fit a MixPre 10 into $2,000 with the noise assist, and then you'd have the XLR outs that you'd want as well. Go ahead, Courtney.
If you have a desktop or a laptop that has a NVIDIA video card in it, like a 3050, 3060. The RTX voice app for that does a really good job of noise removal, and it works in conjunction with OBS and a lot of other plugins, so you might look into that.
I think we need to get all of these in a room with a fan. Like I feel like, I think that because I've heard the RX noise reduction, and I've also listened to Crisp and a couple other ones. I've just not found any of them to be as pleasing to my ears as noise assist. And I've done a lot of noise reduction for a long time. And so I think that's the only thing I would say is that I think that it would be really nice to hear not only how much it takes out, but what it leaves behind. Go ahead, John.
I can volunteer my room as tribute. I have a giant HVAC system behind me. It is off right now, so I'm able to have original sound on, but typically, I'm like crushing everything with noise assist up to like -16 plus using Zoom to kind of make it usable in this room.
Yeah. Next question.
From Tlaloc, Miguel Lopez Waterman in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm still wishing for a good HDMI strain relief from my Blackmagic Design 6K. I know that there's a 90-degree version from Small Rig that is only indicated for the 4K. Any suggestions on what to use?
Go ahead, Carl.
So I would suggest Tether Tools HDMI cable is good. You don't have to use that cable, but the tether plate or some knockoff of it. So the tether plate, because if you have a cage on your 6K as well, you can put tether plate on the side, on the top. So it just needs a flat surface to go against, and then you kind of thread the HDMI cable and you loop it out, nice into your camera. So if anyone trips on it, it'll pull the tether plate. So it may damage HDMI cable, probably won't, and it may send your camera flying, but it won't damage your HDMI port. So especially if you have a cage. But yeah, so a tether plate on a cage, or you can just put a tether plate on the base of the 6K. That's the way they're designed. And then tether tools have the reason why tether tools have the cables that go well with it, because they've got the right gauge cable, but you can use other cables.
Go ahead, Bill.
And I was going to suggest tether tools too. You don't have to use the plate. They also have a whole variety of small, very robust little things with loops on them that you can connect to some part of the camera, and then a clickable strain relief for the cable. So they're very flexible. That's one of their approaches, and it's a really good one if you want to go in that direction. But if you don't want to bolt something to the camera, their individual little strain relief packets, and they've got bunches of them, are really good for this choice.
Yeah, another thing that I've been using for that, I was trying to put it together to show it to you, but is sprig. You know, the sprigs. If you already have a small rig cage, you know, you have these little sprig go right into the 1/4-20s, and you can kind of build something that's going to take a lot more out. Will it fix it if someone really pulls on it hard? I don't know, but from the basic wear and tear, it's not going to have it be constantly being pulled one way or the other if you route it around it. Next question.
Eric Butkus from Chicago. Any virtual mixer solutions? For example, software for a Dante network. I'm looking to build 2 monitor mixes in a video studio with just a couple of inputs, in-studio microphones plus remote contributors. Hardware seems like overkill. Would a DAW work?
Good, Mickey.
I certainly don't think in this situation that the piece of hardware would be overkill, especially if you have, since this is primarily for building building monitor mixes. If you have an in-house talent listening to another in-house microphone from another talent, the delay that software processing does is enough to be very, very distracting to your talent. So I would highly recommend getting a simple, relatively affordable mixer to take care of the monitor mixes. But if you want to experiment with it, yes, you can certainly get it done with a DAW. Just expect that delay to be distracting.
Good, Carl.
Yeah, so as Mickey said, you do get a delay. If using a DAW, you just be like a kind of delay. But the Flow 8 can do 3 separate mix monitors to people in the room, and can do 3 separate mix monitors to virtuals, or 1 in the room and 2 virtual. So the Flow 8's pretty good. It's about $250 US at the moment.
Go ahead, Mickey.
It being a DAW doesn't necessarily make it have a delay. It's if the processing is happening in CPU. Now there are DAWs that are able to utilize dedicated DSP hardware. Now, if you have a DAW that does that, then you can achieve or very low latency with that.
Go, Bill.
And I just wanted to say, we're talking about delay, and it really can shut a talent down. I've told this story before, but I was at one point in my career the stadium announcer for an indoor soccer team, and I had, between saying a word on my microphone and it getting out to the surrounding crowd, about a second of delay. And the very first time I walked into that, it shut my brain down. It was impossible for me to do my job of reading copy with that much delay, because your brain just can't handle the disconnect between I said it now and I heard it a full second later. I eventually trained myself to do that, but it's just terrible.
It's only a couple milliseconds. I mean, it's not that much when you go through a DAW, but it's still something that you can hear if it's doing any kind of processing. I will say that I really love to have hardware to manage this kind of thing most of the time. The software is great, and we use it in a lot of places, but I've had all the things you can imagine happen with software trying to manage the whole show. So I even really expensive software, and especially when you start talking about Dante networks, and then you talk about the software, and then you talk about time code, and then you start talking, there's a lot of things that can go wrong that oftentimes with hardware, it's just going to pass through. And it's just there, and it just has a slider, and it just does the thing. So I would highly recommend hardware. Next question.
John Snyder, Reno, Nevada, asked, Mickey often comments about whether a microphone suits a person's voice. Is there something specific he's listening for? Is it possible to tell in advance what mic makes a good choice for a person?
Good, Mitchell.
I have a very personal relationship with my mic U87 behind me, and I've been using it a very long time. So when I have headphones on and I'm talking into a microphone, I know how I should sound coming back to myself. learned. You just do it after a period of time. You learn how it should sound. And I guess I've gravitated towards what I thought was the best mic that I could afford to buy at the time. And I know how that sounds in my head, so everything else tends to get compared to it. So large format condenser, modern condenser microphones seem to be what I'm looking for. And I've kind of crafted my voice a little bit to work well with them. So that's the relationship I have with it. But I can't tell you how good a mic sounds unless I hear it in my headphones while I'm speaking into it.
For some reason, when you said you had a personal relationship, I expected like a little photo album of you like drinking beers with the mic, and then the two of you hanging out, going on vacation with the mic.
Selfies, lots of selfies.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah. When I first got on office hours, I was using an SM7B, and one of the things Mickey mentioned to me was just how much that low presence, especially with the proximity effects, was affecting the clarity of my voice coming out. And so if you look at the frequency response of a microphone and then understand where your voice fits in that frequency and where you're naturally boosting, it can become a problem for anybody. I mean, you're starting to have to EQ that out. I notice when I'm using this microphone, it becomes much easier for me to be heard, for me to be clear versus like an SM7B right in front of me.
Hey, go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. I think what John had mentioned. What I try to do is look for what can help balance out a specific person's voice. Like John has quite a deep voice, and that deeper, like boomier frequency response of an SM7B just tends to emphasize that lower mid-range, and we start to lack that clarity that a little emphasis on the higher end can bring. So with someone like John, I would probably use a microphone that tends to sound a little brighter. If there's a talent that comes in that has a little thinner voice, I'd probably use a microphone that emphasizes the mid lows a bit more, just to give that balance. And you get to figure things out just after a while of listening to different microphones and knowing what each microphone's characteristics are.
Yeah, we just swapped out. I know with Michael Krasny's show, we had him on an SM7 or MV7, and we swapped him out for a Heil PR40, and I think it made a considerable improvement, over what he was doing there. But we have, the MV7 is a great one to send out to folks, but I have become very sensitive to people being too close to it. Like its proximity is really bassy, and like you really want to. Usually with a Heil, I'm like, go ahead and get pretty close to it, but with the MV7. I want them to be at least 6 to 8 inches away, than much more than I would normally have. Go ahead, Bill.
I want to reflect what Mitchell was saying in the early part. I've used probably 100 different mics over the course of my announcing career. Everything from low end to high end, depending on circumstances. Used to walk into studios a lot. And after you do this for a while, you find that your performance changes based on what you're hearing back. And that's the point that I was wanting to make here. If you're going to be auditioning mics, get a listening system, some kind of a mic chain that lets you hear the mic itself. Because if you can't hear it, if you're just standing in front of it and you don't have headphones on and you're trying to figure out how to mold your performance to get the best out of that mic, it's not going to work. You must have that instantaneous feedback. And then you have to learn how to listen so that you understand. I mean, I've had a lot of people stand in front of a mic and they're popping P's and splashing S's, and their performance hasn't been tuned to what that mic is putting out. And so it's a relationship. I do believe that after time, if you want to do this really seriously.
And it also, every mic depends on the environment that you're in. So for instance, this with noise assist in my office, that's pretty well padded. The Stellar X2 works really well. I took it with me to LA to open it up in the first hotel room I was in that didn't have any carpet and it looked really nice on the web. Anyway, so the hotel, but it was all hard surfaces. And I turned it on and I was like, oh, I can't use this mic here. And so then I switched over to the SB7, the one that Karl had, and that one worked fine because it just had a lot more off-axis rejection. So this one picks up more detail in my voice, but it also will pick up more of the room. And so those are the things that you have to kind of take into account, is not just your voice, but also the environment that you're going to use it in. Go ahead, Courtney.
And if you have someone who has a lot of sibilance, you probably want to go more with the dynamic microphone because it's a little less sensitive to high frequency response than a large diaphragm condenser. Large diaphragm condenser has a very light diaphragm in it, which is mylar, and can vibrate. Just a little bit of vibration goes a long way in a large diaphragm condenser. And with a moving coil dynamic, you have to actually move a coil of wire inside a little tube. And so it's not quite as good on capturing high frequency details. So if you have someone with a lot of mouth noises, who have a lot of noise when they speak, or if they're very sibilant, have whistling S's, then you probably don't want to use a large diaphragm condenser on those persons.
Karl.
Yeah, to what Courtney was saying, so ribbon mics have also used that. So announcers have the lip mics, which are ribbon mics. So they also have like a roll-off at around 14 or 15K for sibilance. So that's another way you can do it too.
Next question.
Eric Antonio from Washington, D.C. Eric asked, other than Recap, are there any other Autodesk products that deserve a beginner's attention? I was able to activate educational access, so I want to take advantage of it. Thanks.
The education program for Autodesk is pretty good. It's right up there with Maxon. Maxon, by the way, if you want to use anything and you're an educator, it's like $9 a year or something like that to get everything. So definitely check that out. But yeah, other ones that I would look at is probably Maya. You'll see that you'll have 3D Studio and Maya. I don't know how anyone gets anything done in 3D Studio, to be honest with you. I mean, I've never understood it. I've opened it up, can't figure it out. AutoCAD is, of course, a standard to look at. Revit is going to be more towards the BIM area. So once you start, Recap, or how we use Recap anyway, is to take scans and so on and so forth and realign them and get them set up. The next step from that oftentimes is Revit. It depends on what vertical you're trying to go through. Mudbox is a lot of fun, so Mudbox is just, I don't use it in production very much, but when you open it up, you're painting in 3D. It's very much like ZBrush, but the interface feels a little bit more like a actual production tool. And then, of course, ones that are really fun, if you're not paying for them, is Flame. Flame is in there, and it does a lot of really cool things. The amount of time it will take you to get good at it will be heavy, and if you ever have to actually use it for production, it's real money. It's like $4,000 or $5,000 a year to own it. And we've got a Flame artist in our group. And so if you are a Flame artist, the amount of what you can charge is usually pretty good because not that many of them are left. So it's those things of keeping track. Next question.
Harshid Trivedi from Daytona Beach, Florida. I wonder what your thoughts are on the approach that NASA has taken in this YouTube video. There's a link there to the Artemis 1 rocket.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
It's very interesting. It's like a movie trailer, essentially. NASA's kind of selling it as a hero rocket to take us to the moon. But the interesting part about it is that it's monetized. They're suggesting a $7 subscription will get you access to see the launch in 6 days. So there you go.
They're charging for it?
Yeah, they sure are.
Oh, I just saw Notify Me.
It's $7 subscription.
It might be maybe because I'm Premiere or whatever. I pay for the extra that I don't have to watch ads. Maybe that's part of it. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, it seems like it's an interesting thing. You're exactly right. They're making this into more of a movie trailer rather than a straight news kind of thing. I think they want to promote that. I mean, some of the aspects of it, the first female going to do that, first person of color, I mean, those things are reaching out into the community and saying, hey, everybody come play. And I love that part of it. I'm not sure that they've hit all these notes right. It's like I was wondering, why did they use Drew Barrymore? She's not quite known for science and things like that. But all that said, anything that helps STEM get more cachet and increase its reach into the younger people out there so that they're interested in those careers, I'm all for that. So good job in that area.
Good, Karl.
So I've always seen NASA as a bit of a hit and miss with their public videos that they put out, so their public affairs videos. I know they have contractors that come in. So I know that half the staff that work for NASA are contractors because there's a staffing limit, by legislation, how many staff they can have at the agency. So they actually bring in contractors and bloat out during these kind of things. They do charge for, like, if you go to the Banana Causeway, that kind of stuff, when you go to watch rocket, they do charge you because they put up stands. Well, contractors come in, put up stands, and then they take down those stands. So depending on where you want to watch rocket from, they do charge you a small price because they do have to put up stands, and they usually have to pay contractors for security guards. So they're not NASA personnel that do that. They're actually paid contractors, and essentially what you're paying, your few dollars you pay if you go onto the actual, if you're a US citizen and you go onto the actual base, either Kennedy or the Air Force base. They do charge you a little bit, but they have done some good videos, but I'd say it's about 1 in 100. So 1 in 100 of these kind of videos turn out quite well. Like they did the 7 Minutes of Terror, about 10 years ago for the Mars mission, which was a massive video. It was very good. It was like a 7-minute trailer, essentially. It had the energy of a 7-minute trailer. This one is a very cookie cutter trailer music, trailer cuts, trailer, all that kind of stuff. But it is about 1 in 100. I think Goddard are the best because they do them in-house. So Goddard actually have the NASA staff do it themselves. So if you go to NASA Goddard's channel and look at their education outreach, their videos are by far the best. That's because they usually get the interns and the younger staff to do it. And it's a little bit more in tune in how to communicate something in like 2 to 4 minutes. They're pretty good at it.
You good, Courtney?
And what's interesting is there's been a convergence over the last decade or so of their CGI previs and the quality of the onboard video coming from the launches. And as they intersect, we won't be able to tell the difference between the realistic CGI and the onboard video, and that's going to launch millions of conspiracy theorists out there.
Go ahead, Bill.
This is the tiniest thing, but I have to say, I was looking at the Artemis logo and I thought, well, that's interesting. It kind of looks like alien type. I wonder why they cut the corners off the bottom left side of the letters. And then I thought to myself, do I really want to be thinking about spaceflight and the term cut corners in my brain? So it was the weirdest little thing. And it's some focus group. I wonder why somebody didn't say that.
I really like the animation of the logo at the end. I just felt like it was very smooth and just kind of had a good feel to it. It of course has me excited that they might actually spend the kind of money that I think they should spend on these launches. If you're spending billions of dollars on a launch, I would highly recommend to any space company to spend millions of dollars on the broadcast and not just raw cameras. This is an opportunity to have people, you have a whole bunch of people watching, potentially high hundreds of thousands, low millions of people watching. And you could use it as this huge education platform to talk about space and propulsion and process and what it takes. And there's so much that you could pack into a launch that all that space is generally unused. You know, like when I watch a SpaceX, or there's just a whole lot of like raw cameras, which is fine. I think that the first orbit that was done by Blue Origin was probably better. You know, like it was, you know, there was more to it than they had some cool drone shots. They had a couple other things, but there's so much opportunity. And the reason that's important, I think, is because it helps inspire kids to want to get into engineering, want to get into astrophysics, and want to get into all those other things. They want to get into those things because I got into a lot of that. I got into rockets because I was watching shuttle launches. You know, the shuttle launches and everything else is what inspired me to, I imagine my little rockets like shuttles, you know, and like going to space. And so I was making rockets all the time, and I was inspired by the space program, you know, and I think that we've kind of lost that a little bit. And I think part of it is that they just don't invest enough in really making it, you know, taking full advantage that there's a lot of people watching. And I think that what they should do is partner with a streamer, you know, get like Apple or Amazon or something like that and let them throw $10 million into it. They'd get a lot of views, you know, like it would be, you know, it'd be worth it. I think for most streamers to take advantage of it. They can still have the raw feed for free, but to have one that is like we're going to turn the dial all the way up. Next question.
And it's from Guy Cochran in Seattle. How do you host a LiDAR scan for clients to view?
Go ahead, Jason.
Well, it really depends on the workflow. If you're actually talking just about LiDAR that, like, you know, really just comes off of the app and like that's it. Polycam, I think if you subscribe to it, it gets better, has been kind of growing by leaps and bounds. And their publication, I think, is included for not a subscription. I think it's one time. If you're looking to, like, you know, get LiDAR and then mess with it a little bit, Sketchfab and Pix4D, I think, are kind of the industry standards. I will put links in the chat for, actually, I'll do some photogrammetry too from a Netflix Old West set in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico.
Yeah, from Polycam, as Jason said, you can, and I paid the subscription, so I don't know what's available in the free version versus the paid version, but the paid version will export lots of different file formats, including USDZ. So you could literally capture something with Polycam. You can text it to another Apple user. So you can text it to them and it'll just pop open. They can have it jump to scale right in front of them. So that's Polycam will do that already. From viewing the Lidar, and when I say that, I'm going to specifically say, now the Polycam is generating one kind. That's it building a model. It's kind of Lidar. I mean, like what the phone has is Lidar. It is Lidar, but it's like Lidar for kids. So once you start getting into real Lidar, where you're generating E57 files, you can use a thing called MeshLab. MeshLab is an app that is free on PC and Mac and Unix, and you can open up an E57 file from there. You can also use it to it takes a little bit more work, but you can align it that way as well. Of course, you can also take it into something like Recap Pro, really do all the alignment with all the E57 files, and then deliver a point cloud for the client. Now, I will admit, we don't usually show the clients the scans. They don't know what to do with them. Like they don't even know what they're looking at. What we show them is either SketchUp models or other things that are been generated accurately from those E57 files. So the scans are typically for us, not for the client. When we're scanning these or when we're getting them scanned. But we can deliver them to them. And again, once they've been registered, and again, Recap Pro is going to be is probably the most popular thing to use. The most powerful is called Trimble Business Systems, which is the stupidest name. Anyway, but TBS is I think it's Trimble, TBC, Trimble Business Center. Why you would call your scanning software a business center, I don't know, but it's probably the most powerful for managing a lot of these things. But it's really expensive. But you can do a lot of it in Recap. Next question.
Tony Mobley from Newton, Georgia asks, can Mickey share his setup today for audio and video?
Go ahead, Mickey.
You caught me there adjusting the camera. I'm using an old iPhone as a camera with Filmic Pro. That's going into an ATEM Mini, which is going into an AJAU tap to be captured into the computer. My mic is an AKG 414 going into a Sound Devices Sound 440, good old 7 series Sound Devices recorder, excellent preamps, feeding into an Avid Matrix I/O, and into the computer, into audio hijack for delay and loop back into Zoom.
There you go. Next question.
And it's for me, has the Dante AVIO supply chain gotten better?
Go ahead, John.
It looks like Sweetwater and B&H Photo have several different models of the AVIO in stock. So in stock is better than out of stock. So yes.
Go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah, over the past couple of months, it's been, it looks like stock has been arriving in bursts. It would arrive, store resellers would have them in stock and it would be gone in less than a week. Then you have to wait a week or two for them to get stock again.
And I have to admit, I used to not take these very seriously. I was like, how can these little things be doing Dante and everything else? But they are like magical. We have so many of them now. Oh, I'd like to run something to here. I'd like to run something there. And everything's just an Ethernet cable away instead of running analog. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, once you get into them, you can't leave it behind. And I have it just because of my 205. And I'm still waiting on an AES AVIO so I can get AES in and out. But I've got 2 analog in and outs here if anybody really desperately needs them. But I think their value is dropping precipitously with the news here.
Next question.
Todd Perry from Prescott, Arizona, looking for some input on a remote interview kit based around the Link camera. Any thoughts on improvements before shipping it out?
Go ahead, John.
From what I see in the kit, everything that I would think would be included is there, except for an Ethernet adapter and Ethernet cable. I would not rely on Wi-Fi if you're doing any sort of remote participation, but other than that, looks like a great kit.
Looks like a great kit. I was amazed. I was like, he just built this because the Link has only been out for a couple of weeks. So Todd, really, really well done. I looked at it and I opened it up and I was like, holy smokes. Like he's pretty serious about this. A couple of things that I would consider. I would, I think the laptop's good. If I was building into a kit, I'd really think about the kit with a Mac Mini. Now, I know that the advantage that you get there is that you have a battery in the laptop, but it is, a lot of times when we build these kits, we don't want anyone there to actually touch the keyboard. Like we want to take it over. And that gets back to what John was talking about, having Ethernet and then having some kind of remote in. So a VPN or AnyDesk or Parsec or something like that is to let us control it. And then the monitor would give you a little bit more flexibility. I'd also think about having you have a 6C on the top. I'd put it on either side and the top if I could, kind of like a model mirror. I think that you'd find that light would make people look better. The only question I have is when someone sits at it, is there a way to make it higher? So a lot of times with that case opened, the height of that camera may not be as high as you'd like it to be for an average person. So that would be the only other thing that I would think about there. But overall, wow, it looks like a really cool kit. It kind of inspires me to want to build a new kit with that little camera. But so anyway, really, really well done. Next question.
Next question from Douglas Carmichael. When reporting a bug in a product, what are some practices to remember?
Go ahead, John.
I think the two key things for me, what I want to see if someone's reporting something, is what are the steps to reproduce it? And if you can provide a video, that's even more beneficial.
Yeah, go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, what John says is true. A video is very essential. And the other thing is do your homework. Make sure it's not just a sample problem with a bug. It's just the one that you have. Make sure it's across all of them. If it happens on more than one, or if you go onto a forum somewhere for that product and state that you've had a problem doing such and such and you've discovered this bug, and if other people have discovered the same bug, then that's when you go and report it to the manufacturer. If you're the only one that seems to be having this bug, it may be operator error. It may be the situation that you're using the product in that's creating the problem. Maybe some other piece of software that's interfering with the software that you're installing, if it's software. So you have to do carefully research and make sure it's repeatable on a number of different platforms. Try it on different computers if you have different computers and see if it does exactly the same thing on each one of them.
Yeah, and it's just so important to be methodical about it, because if you send something up and it doesn't work, or this just broke, no one's going to respond to you. I mean, they don't really process it. But if I've sometimes written like multiple pages for someone that I've been beta testing for, of this is exactly how this works. This is why it doesn't work. This is what's, and sometimes it's an obscure bug that I need fixed. When you put the energy into it, oftentimes you just have to remember there's a programmer that's trying to put out a bunch of, you're not the only bug, there's many bugs. And what they're going to pick is the ones that are easiest to fix. So the ones that they see that are like, these are easy wins, and that means that you were specific, you really it's repeatable, you got down to those areas, you're going to get that bug fixed in the next build or the next couple builds. Whereas if you aren't specific and detailed, they'll tend to, it'll just sit around for a while. Next question.
Clive Kitchener from British Columbia, Canada. I need guidance on tonal mapping. I think it is. I'm trying to apply the tones of the old photograph to the iPhone 10 image on the right, messing with the DeSat Tonal Curves, Pixelmator Pro. And he's got a link there.
Good, Bill.
I think this is a classic example of the difference between making a picture and taking a picture. If you look at these examples, and I think we have them at the back, and we're going to pop them up here in a minute on screen. The one on the left is someone taking a picture. They're in a real environment. They pointed their camera toward the subject with his guitar, and they took the picture. The one on the right, a photographer, made that picture. And I say that because look at the difference in illumination, in background lighting, in highlights. Everything about the photo on the right was crafted. He has enough light in his face to bring you up there. Behind his face, he's got a white area or a lighter area that draws you to that part of the photo so you see him naturally, which you do because you look at people in photos first. The tones fall off to the left except for the banjo, which is the other object that wants to draw your eye here. That is a beautifully crafted photo, and whoever did that back in the 1800s, great job. You understood your craft. The one on the left is a snapshot. Somebody was standing in a room and they took a picture. There's no highlight, there's no low light, there's no control over it. Now, with modern tools, you can make improvements on this substantially, but you have to do it through masking, putting things like ovals of highlight and then repositioning the person over it so they don't get blown out, working on the contrast of the person's face and on the guitar. It's possible, but I do think this is a really good example of the difference between snapshots and photography.
Go ahead, Carl.
So the older image on the right, so the background is actually a painting.
I'm a little confused by is he said I'm trying to apply the tones of the old photograph Oh, yeah, to the iPhone image on the right, which so that would be the banjo, which
The banjo is the older. That's the older image.
Yeah, that's what I think too. Yeah.
So you can tell the image on the left is taken with a camera that has color filters. So this is another thing as well. So because there is no black and white camera, unless you spend quite a bit of money to actually buy a digital black and white camera, your camera is actually 3 different color filters. So it's actually, and then the computer, you can do certain things. But green is usually one you don't want. So usually you'd want red, or you want actually pan-chrome. Anyway, so the one on the right is actually in a studio. So people who used to do this for portraits, this is how you used to get your portraits done. And this person's chosen to have a portrait with their banjo. Now the banjo obviously has high contrast to the suit he's wearing. So that's right. And then the neck of the banjo is actually reflecting the sunlight. So it'll be sunlight coming in, it wouldn't be a flash. The sunlight coming in from the screen right, so the right of screen. The background is a painting. So this is how studios, they just roll down canvas paintings, and they don't paint where the person stands. So you'll notice that that's part of the canvas where it's not painted so much. So that's actually the blank canvas. And you'll notice that the edge of his face is actually dark, and they do that on purpose because the painting is actually left alone. They actually don't paint part of it. And so there's a high contrast between the edge of his face and the back canvas. But yeah, that is a painting in the background. The little stand there is real. You still see these kind of paintings. A lot of royals had these right up until the 1950s. They had these kind of paintings in the background. The Queen's official coronation photograph is in front of a painting on canvas. But yeah, the contrast of the banjo, the contrast of the banjo neck, and the contrast of the little white pocket. So that would have definitely been something that done after the fact. They would have put a little white pocket in there to break out the contrast there. And then the edge of his face, the fact that the far side of his face is very dark, and then the background behind him is quite light. And then the fact that he is actually lit, and the fact that he's got a little bit of silver hair does help as well. So the silver hair, because the top, they haven't lit, you notice it's an edge lighting, there's no top lighting, because the top of his hair is actually quite dark. But that also works with the background.
I'd love to see what the color photo looks like of the iPhone shot. I don't know how to fix this in Pixelmator, but I can tell you that we could probably get a lot closer to what you saw in the original if you had the color version. I took it into Photoshop and used Channel Mixer. This allows you to basically customize your black and white delivery per channel. And you can sit there and you'll pull things up and down. And that gets back to what Karl was talking about. You'd probably pull the green channel back and let the red channel have a lot more room to run. And I bet you would get much, much closer to what you see in the older photo. Next question.
Next question in from Peter Belbin in Houston. Do you have a favorite aftermarket supplier of microphone wind pop filters? I rather like the Gutmann products. There's a link to it.
Go ahead, Mickey.
Rycote, they make excellent products for all sorts of microphones, from wind protection for shotgun mics to pop filters to little stickies and overcovers for lavalier microphones. Check them out. They have a wide range of products.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
If I'm using a pop filter like a foam pop filter, I'm generally working on using one from the manufacturer because it's form fitted. This is a foam wind pop filter that's on an AKG 414. Interestingly enough, this 414, before I got on office hours, sat in a case for about 2 or 3 years, and when I brought out the foam on it, it just completely disintegrated. So this one is shaped. You can't see real well. I can show you a little bit better. It's shaped specifically to the microphones. You can see it on a 3/4 angle, that it makes more sense. And you just can't always get that from a third-party manufacturer. For my U87 behind me, I use one of these guys, or I should be using one of these guys. Unfortunately, I've created sacrilege here for Mickey, and I left the foam on my U87. But this is the way you should do it. And this is made by a company called Paulson or Pulsco. I think it's an Italian manager, but it's just a screen. And this has been around for hundreds of years.
Good. Courtney, real quick.
I use Windtech, Windtech. They make foam microphone windscreens for most popular microphones, including the Sennheiser lines and any of the lines like the NT1, etc. So they're a good choice, and they're a lot less expensive than the original manufacturers or Rycotes or any of the more expensive windscreen.
Next question.
Next question in from Douglas Carmichael. Alex, you mentioned being aware of who you are asking a question to. For those on the autism spectrum, for example, where clear, specific over-communication is best, Would it be appropriate to mention that?
Generally, I try to mention as little about who I am and mostly about what I do when I'm talking to folks. And over communication is not usually something that I recommend. That's not what I do. I tend to communicate what is necessary. Especially when I'm dealing with folks that I'm working with. I don't use 10 words when 5 words would do. And so it tends to move things down the path faster. And I don't generally explain a lot of things about myself other than what needs to get done. Next question.
Chris Widener from Lafayette, Indiana. If you were going to record someone and there's a link, a style window or shape for projection playback, just green screen or...
And this is a good example of something that works better if you send it to us ahead of time, because we can take a look at it. It's a little harder here. This looks it looks really cool. This is one of those ones that projects, I think, things up against the wall. So you could probably do this over black or green screen, but I think that these are projections that you can project up against your windows for Halloween and so on and so forth. And I think that you'd probably use either. A lot of them are just CG over black, but I think, and I'm going to let John answer this one, then we'll move on because John's done a bunch of this.
So I use the Atmos effects along with some other stuff for projection mapping, but these are great. My pro tip for these is to go to Bed Bath & Beyond and get the frosted shower curtain. And that's what I put in the window, and then I project onto that, and it is absolutely perfect.
Halloween is coming up, so I'm thinking of doing this year just because I haven't done it, and I saw John's last year, and it's like I got to do something. All right, next question.
Samuel Norvik from Norway. And Samuel asked, Karl, have you configured the Flow 8 into your Zoom setup?
Go ahead, Karl.
No, I'm unable to show my actual app today because I've actually got a different setup for the second hour. But essentially, yeah, so I'm using the headphones out of, so as far as monitoring, I'm using the headphones out. That's what my in-ears are plugged into. They're plugged into that. And then with Bluetooth that comes from the computer, it only goes to the headphones. That's the key. That's how you guys don't hear yourself coming back to yourself. So that's pretty much the only thing. There's about 10 other ways to route as far as you want to mix before it goes in. I know everyone on the panel has a little bit of a different way of getting it into the panel. But as far as monitoring, which is the most important stuff, so I can listen to anything on my computer. I can hear the Zoom call. I can hear like anything that I've got plugged into it through the headphones. And then in the preferences for routing, simply just go to BT headphones. So Bluetooth headphones, simply make it that only USB goes to the headphones. There's nothing else. And that way USB will never go into the mix itself. That's a main change I have versus anything else.
Next question.
Deborah Woodfork from Washington, D.C. Deborah asked, anyone using Logi Dock? Logitech is pushing this as part of a home kit for office and hybrid meetings.
Go ahead, John.
It looks okay. The feature set and the connectivity look good, but I'm sure the microphone and speakers are lacking. And of course, my video is off. I apologize. I definitely probably wouldn't recommend it if you're doing anything serious, but if it's just replacing like a built-in mic that you're using today, probably an upgrade, but I would definitely look for something else if you care about audio quality.
Yeah. I'm going to hold out my final, what I'm going to finally... I'm going to hold out. Maybe we should test it and see how it goes. I think that my opinion about speaker phones, any kind of like microphone in a box that's 2 or 3 or 4 feet away from a person, is that I truly believe it was created by the devil to slow down the progress of the human race. Like, I just think that it's so, as on the tail end of people using speakerphones, you're spending half the time trying to figure out what someone's saying as opposed to listening to what they're saying. You don't think about what they're saying because you're trying to figure out what they just said. So maybe they created something that defies the laws of audio physics and it sounds great, but I don't care about how it sounds for me. I want it to be something that is great to listen to for the other side. That's why we spend a lot of money on mics. Next question.
Next question from David Brady in New York. New York, is it possible to use Polycam free? Make a scan and export the results to a Polycam Pro Premier account. What format is best to use?
Yeah, Polycam is this 3D scanning app that we've used, and I don't know. Because I have the pro version of it. Maybe someone here can download Polycam free. Remember that it's a monthly subscription too. So if you need to export something to somebody, pay for a month and then immediately. This is what I do with a lot of subscriptions. I pay for a month and then I immediately go into I wait for a day. I don't know why I wait for a day, but I wait for a day. And then I go up and cancel the subscription. And then if I need it again, and it says, oh, you have to resubscribe, then I go, okay, I'll resubscribe. I don't leave my subscriptions live unless I'm using it all the time and I know I'm going to use it all the time. I turn them off all the time so that they just expire if I'm not using them. And I've saved a lot. I first used to cost me a lot of money. Now I save a lot of money because I do it that way. All right. We are changing subjects. We've got Karl here. We've also got Nick Batt is joining us to talk about synthesizers. Karl's going to be walking us through some of these pieces, and Nick is going to be adding his 2 cents. We're really hoping to have at least once a month, get Karl, Nick, anyone else who's really into synthesizers to get up here and talk a little bit about it, because it's something that I find fascinating, and we're really, really glad to have both Karl and Nick here to talk about synthesizers. And I think that hopefully, there's a large portion of our group that actually gets into this. So Karl, I'm going to let you take it away and talk about what you're going to this is basically a Synthesizers 101. And Nick, feel free, you don't have to raise your hand as much during this open area. You can just kind of kick in things while Karl's talking as well, anything you want to add. But otherwise, for the other panelists, go ahead and raise your hand for the stuff there. Anyway, go ahead, Karl.
So what I'm going to go through today is a bit of what the architecture is of a synthesizer, maybe answer some questions that I can see coming up about what's different than a keyboard, and like an arranger, those kind of things. I won't be going in depth to each of the sections. That'll be in the workshops we do in after hours. So I'm going to keep it quite light here and hopefully just generate some questions. I do have slides from the workshops available. So if you do have like a more detailed question, I can bring up one of the slides and just talk to it rather than, teaching against it. But yeah, so I'm simply just going to go through what a synthesizer is, kind of what the sections are, and kind of how they can interact with each other. Keep it kind of basic for this first one. So I'll show my overhead. So here's a synthesizer. This is called a Gaia, Roland Gaia. It's a digital synth. It's probably not the best sounding synth in the world, but it's one of the best teaching synths. This is Berklee School of Music uses these, mainly because there is no display. So there is, I know you're not seeing the entire synth, but there is zero display, not even like a digit display to tell you what parameter you're on. It's all knobs, it's all functions as far as all the different areas. So, and it has lights here for presets and that kind of stuff. So you do have some shortcuts to presets and that kind of stuff. But as far as there's no digital display at all. There's no menu diving. So that's why it's kind of good for teaching, because what you see is what you get. I can go to manual mode. So when I do that, what's on the panel is what we're going to hear. I should be live, so you should be able to hear what we're hearing. So that's just a sawtooth wave. And then what we're going to do is we're also going to go through some of the slides that I've prepared. So with the slides, I'll bring them up now. So you can see I've got a waveform monitor here. So we can actually see the waveforms. And we'll go through the slides pretty quickly. So this is just an architecture overview. So the oscillator. So that's what we've heard already. So the oscillator is pretty important as far as, so this is this section here, and it's the top part of the oscillator here. So we're actually looking at a sawtooth. And so with sawtooth, if I actually can do this properly, let's see if I can actually get it done right. So if I do that, it should work. And there we go. So sawtooth, it looks like a sawtooth with my voice. And we'll change to a square. So these are the different waves you get in the oscillator section, and these are kind of the building blocks. So a pulse wave. Just for you, Nick. And then we've got a triangle wave. That's probably the nicest triangle wave I've ever seen on a digital. And then something you don't see all the time, which is a sine wave. So this is quite a nice sine wave. And then for those 90s fans out there, super saw. So essentially, this is 7 saw waves that are detuned slightly from each other. This is a Roland special. So that's the oscillator. So essentially with the oscillator, they are the building blocks. This particular synth can do 3 separate oscillators in the way it can work. As far as all the other kind of building blocks you can have in other types of synthesizers, there are additive synthesizers, it's FM synthesizers. We'll get into FM a little bit with this one. This one can do some pretty basic FM. But there's different types. There's granular synthesizers, but we'll get into that. And in the workshops, we'll go through more of what they are, but we'll try and keep it simple for today. So if I click on this should work. Okay. So the next section we'll look at will be the audio mixer. Now, the guy has got a really interesting audio mixer and a little bit different to others. I think it's a little bit different to most. That the fact that the audio mixer on this, we actually have 3 complete synths here. So technically they're single voice synths, so it's a single oscillator, but it's a full synth and there's 3 of them. So I can pick this one, I can pick this one, and pick this one. So we actually have all 3 here on the left. And the mixer, the way the mixer works is I can pick this one and pick the volume for this. So I can have this one at full volume. I can have this one at like 70% volume. I can have this one at 50% volume. And that's my mixer. So by selecting them and selecting my level, that'll be the mixer for this. And then I have master volume, of course. But the way we'll do it today, we'll just stick to one, keep it basic. The other thing that we'll look at as well is with this is pretty much how the flow, so what goes into what, and they do have it laid out on the panel quite nicely. So on the panel here, we do see oscillator, that goes into filter, that goes into amp. I'm showing you the mixer because the mixers generally, if you take a look like a Moog, you usually have the oscillators, and after each oscillator, you usually have a mixer per voice. Over here, it's a little bit different in the structure, but I sort of just put that in for that one. So if we go to the next slide. So now we're going to talk about the filter. So the filter is probably the most characterful part of the synthesizer. So this is the filter section here. There's usually, on every synthesizer, there's usually going to be 2 kind of parameters that you can change for the filter. Some only have one type of filter, so some only have a local low-pass filter. This one has a multi-mode filter, it's a digital multi-mode filter, but it has a cutoff and has resonance. These can be labeled as different things, so these can be labeled as frequency and emphasis, so they can have different names on different synthesizers, but cutoff and resonance is probably the most common names. So this is a low-pass filter. So what the low-pass filter means is I'll play a note, and then I'm actually cutting the frequencies. And I can change the slope, so I can make it even more aggressive. So that's a 4-pole, 24 dB slope, which is more the Moog style. And then a 12 dB, which is a little bit less of a slope, which is more the Yamaha style, what Yamaha's famous for in their old analogs. So the filter also has resonance. So I'll put resonance at probably, let's say, maybe 40%, and we'll see what the resonance does. So what it does, it actually picks out a particular frequency, and it makes that particular frequency quite bright. The frequency is where I'm picking from the cutoff. If I go 24, it'll be even more aggressive. You're actually hearing the harmonics. That's sing-songy. They're the harmonics. Pretty much the first 6 harmonics are quite sing-songy. So the next part we're going to take a look at is the VCA. So the VCA is probably the most, it's a heavy lifter. It's the one that does all the heavy lifting essentially for the synth as far as creation, I think. So on this particular synthesizer, it's simply just one knob. But essentially this one knob is where I get to adjust the VCA. So take resonance off. So I can do that myself. I can just change the knob, make it go quieter, make it half. I can do a tremolo effect with my hand. But I may want to actually do this another way. So I may want other parts of the synthesizer here to affect this knob and affect this knob in different ways over time, depending on when I press the button. Maybe it will start, or maybe it's always running in the background and it doesn't matter when I press the button. It'll just affect it all the time. So that brings us up to the next section, which this is where we start to. So we see we've only got green arrows at the moment, which is the audio signal. Now we can actually start to actually bring in like an envelope, which is going to be the modulation signals. So these are essentially the robots that help control your knobs on your synthesizer rather than you having to do it. Many hands make light work. So there we saw the envelope going into the amp. So this is the envelope here for the amp. So it's ADSR. So it's an attack. So when you press the note on, this is a time value. So at the moment, this is set to 0 down the bottom. Decay, which is also a time value. At the moment, I've got set to 0. Sustain, this is actually a level. So this is actually a volume, essentially a volume level for this. So if I have this at the top, this will be at the top. Now, if I set this to 50%, this now goes from 0 to 50%. this is relative to where this is. So I can't make this go above 50%. If I've set the volume knob to 50%, then this whole envelope is between now 0 and 50%. So think of it like a dynamic range. If I go to full volume, I now have full dynamic range in the entire envelope. That means that the attack will go to full volume, decay will come back to wherever the sustain is. So we can see that here on this graph. So the attack goes up to full volume, wherever this is set to. Decay comes down to wherever this is set to. So you can set this to 50, this to 100. And then the release will take it from wherever this is set to down to 0. This is a basic ADSR. There are more complicated ones, but I like this synth because it's basic for teaching as well. So we'll put it back to initialized. So with that, what's going to happen is I'll make it so I'll bring down sustain. If I press something, hear a little bit of a blip, but not hearing any sound. If I bring up the attack a little bit, well, what this is going to do, this is going to bring up the sound to full volume, but because everything is set to 0, after it's hit full volume, it should just drop to nothing. So drops to nothing. Now, if I bring up sustain to half volume, let's say, bring them both up to half, this will go up to full volume, will go up to this level, but then drop down instantly to sustain level. Instantly, because this value here, this is a time value, it's set to 0. So it goes up here, let's say this is 2 seconds, then instantly it'll go to this volume, which is 50% of this. Maybe even less than 50%. So you can hear that it's going up to full volume and then dropping down to whatever this is. Now, if we actually just bring up the decay, so the decay now, I'm telling the decay to go up to full volume and then to come down to 0. Come down to 0 because we're telling it, so it's going to go up and down. Back down to 0. I've got my finger, so if I hold my finger on a note, keep my finger held, it goes to nothing. Take my finger off. Now, if we actually do release here and we put everything in the middle, so everything in the middle, actually I'll put sustain up a little bit higher because I know sustain is going to be quiet on this. So we're going to go up, we're going to come down to this level, but this level will be half about this. And then when I let go, it will go from this level down slowly, well, the same speed roughly as the attack. It will come down. So we heard that it went up, but then came down to a lower level than top volume. Now when I let go, it'll slowly go down to 0. Slowly go down to 0. Whereas quickly go down to 0 if I pull it down. Just instantly off. Now, let's say I push this all the way to the top. We go all the way to the top and we go this one all the way to the top. So we're going to go full volume. So decay won't really matter. So we can take that out because it's not going to matter because it's going to go straight to this anyway. So we can go attack to full volume and then I'll let go. And this is, remember, this is a time value, this one. This is a level volume. So I'll do a chord so we can hear a bit better. Now I'll let go. I'll let go. It's probably about 15 seconds, I reckon. Now, I've got envelopes on some of my synths that go for like 20 minutes. I think Nick's got some as well that will go for like 20 minutes if you set them to full. There are some crazy synthesizers that'll do that. So that was a very long release. That wasn't reverb, that wasn't delay, that was just the release knob. There is reverb and delay on this synthesizer built in with the digital effects, but that's just the release, which we can do on analog synths as well. So if we come back again to where we were on the map, so we've done envelope into the amplifier, so it makes it louder, quieter, and we can shape how it goes louder and quieter. The next one would be the filter. So this one may be a little bit counterintuitive. We're not making the filter necessarily louder. What we're actually doing is we're exposing more of the harmonics and closing off more of the harmonics. So we're adding a filter. We're going to be doing that dynamically. So the way we can do this is I'll come back to the shot here. So this is the filter and these are the envelope. So this one has a special knob that doesn't have on the amp. This actually has a polarity. So we can go positive, which is the same as this. So it gets louder and then comes down, or we can go negative. We can actually have it start and then go down because it's actually controlling this knob. So this envelope is actually just controlling, are we going down? So are we going down at first or are we going up at first? So if I put it in the middle, and if we get this here, get some volume going, I'll I'll get keyboard tracking on. So we got, so that's, it's not fully bright. So fully bright, that's fully bright. We'll come back a bit from fully bright. And let's say we want to open up the filter. So we're going to go a little bit up here and we want to open up the filter and then we'll shut it down. So that's opening up and then instantly shutting down. So it's doing this. It's doing the same thing we were doing over here, but instead of controlling volume, it's now controlling brightness. Essentially, that's another way to think of it. But let's say we want to go up and gradually come down. So we want to go gradually up, gradually down, and we want to make it kind of subtle. So this one here, the envelope depth, we're gonna how far you go away from zero. So this is quite exaggerated. So we're gonna, that's a lot of a turn and a lot of turn back. Here you can do a little bit of a turn, a little bit of a turn. So just a subtle turn. So we'll see how this sounds. So there we went up brighter and then we came down a little bit less, but we kept it subtle, we kept it a bit long as well. So we can actually do sustain. So the sustain is actually interesting. So I can play a chord. So this is essentially no different to doing this. So remember that this one here was whatever this one was. This one's similar. So this one's maximum is wherever we are at on the cutoff filter. And when we come down, if this envelope is in positive, it'll come down relative to this. So if I put this up full and we play a chord, and then we bring it much more subtle. So you can control how much, essentially, the dynamic range of this can be controlled by this depth. This controls your dynamic range. So you can consider this maybe like 3 stops of dynamic range in photography. At the top, it's like 12 stops of dynamic range. That's kind of one way. And then you've got negative dynamic range, which is a whole other thing. So the other part of the filter, which we are looking at here, is the dB. So we've talked about the dB before. So this is a very, essentially, the 12 dB slope is much more less aggressive. It's almost like a filter on an EQ. And if we go 24, it's got a bit more of a bite to it. And then the resonance. So I put the resonance up at halfway. We'll play a chord. Now, chords are interesting. I've got keyboard follow on. So that, therefore, what keyboard follow essentially does, it'll make sure that the filter belongs to each note, because this is a polyphonic synthesizer. So each note essentially is running its own voice. So if we, that's with a 12 dB slope. Then we go 24 dB slope. We can actually pick out the harmonics with a 24. It's a much sharper slope compared to 12. Now we do have other kind of filters, which is like high pass filter. So high pass filter lets have a high pass, and we cut out the bass. So if I put, we have some bass stuff down here. A lot of bass. Take out the resonance. We're only letting the high frequencies through. And then we're letting the bass through. That's a band pass filter, which is band pass is kind of like telephone call. If you think of like your voice on a telephone call, that's one way of thinking of it. So if we do a chord. Now, band pass filter will sound a lot more obvious when you hit 24. So this sounds like you're listening to a synthesizer through a telephone. We have peaking. And then bypass, which means the oscillator simply bypasses through the amp, through the filter and goes out to the amp. Now, the reason why you may want to bypass is you may want to just use your oscillators of this synth and then take the outputs and go into another synth and use the filters on another synth. So there are reasons why you may want to do that. So we'll go back to our little slide here. So we've done envelope. So that's how you can shape the sound, essentially the same way we shape the amp. Now, the other one, this one's a little bit easier to notice. You'll notice this one pretty quickly. So I'll set everything back to what we call initial. So make sure everything's back to center. Okay. So with the pitch, we also have an envelope for pitch here. Now, it's only got the attack and decay. You can get pitch envelopes that have all 4, sometimes have 5 or 6, but this one just has attack and decay. So up and down, and then the envelope depth, positive and negative. So that'll come pretty obvious when you start to hear it. So if I go, so we'll keep the sawtooth. And so here's the pitch. So if I just play a note and I change the pitch, now this is a digital synth, so it's going to step. So steps and semitones, and then you can have a fine detune, half semitone up, half semitone down. So we can actually control, let's say, either one of these, but much more smoothly. So we can actually put these up to halfway. So I'll go up all the way up halfway here, and then again we have to choose whether we're going to go down. So when we start, are we going to go down in pitch, or are we going to go up in pitch when we start? So let's go up in pitch. So if I play a note, you're probably going to guess what's going to happen, but I've got this one set to 0. So it's going to go up in pitch and then drop straight back down to the pitch that we've chosen. So the pitch that we've chosen here, just do that. So the pitch that we've chosen here, which is our, let's say I'm going to do it A. And let's go here and do that. And then we can go that. There we go. So it goes up, but then drops down. So same as the volume. Volume went loud and then nothing. And then we can do the opposite. So we can instantly start at the top and drop down to our note. And then the longer I hold it, it just stays on the note. Then, as you can guess, if we put both up, so that's going up. And then if we put negative, and at the end of the decay, so these are time values. So when this one has finished its time, it will finish at whatever pitch you've chosen. And so I've chosen to be in the middle. So if I'm picking A440, it's going to be that. That's actually A220. So essentially, that's how you use the envelope. Essentially, it's very similar in a way to the filter one, where you have your envelope depth depending on which direction you want to go. The other part that you actually have here is pulse width modulation. So this is probably the worst part of this synth, I think, is the pulse width modulation. It doesn't really do what I would want it to do, but we can actually get it to do some interesting stuff. So what pulse width modulation does, we actually are changing the shape of the actual frequency or the actual wave, and we're actually changing the square shape, whether it's 50%. This one actually goes from about 70% to like 90%. It doesn't actually go right back to 50 unless you actually use pulse width modulation. So that's about 70. That's almost closing. If you use pulse width modulation, which is based off the LFO here, so we're going to use just a nice slow rate there, then we'll go up to 4. So the pulse width modulation here, which is controlled by the rate of the LFO, is controlling this knob. Essentially, this knob is now going up and down. So if I take that down and just do, that's me doing it. By doing this, the LFO is now doing it. Same thing. So, but I personally think this particular synth, and this is things we will go in the workshop, is different synths have different strengths. This one's strength is definitely not pulse width modulation, I'll tell you that much. Back to square wave, keep it simple. Oh, sorry, back to sawtooth. Bring them down. So initialization is something that we do. So I'm in a manual mode here. So what I see is what I'm going to hear. So I know where all the knobs need to be. So I keep my levels. This is my level, so 100%. And the same here with the filter. And then with these ones, I keep them all down. With these ones, I keep them in the middle. There's a center detent for these, so you know where the middle is. There's no envelope depth on the amp. It wouldn't be any use. You can actually use it in modular. So modular synths, you can actually do some interesting stuff with the amps, but not this particular one. And then the LFO. This LFO is a little bit more basic. It has tempo sync, which is nice. And it does have some nice waves. But what we do is we'll go take a look at the next piece of the puzzle, which is the LFO. So the LFO, which we just heard there, controlling the oscillator for pulse width modulation, it can control the amplifier. In this particular synth, it can control the filter, and it can control the oscillator, which we've heard before. Now, this is actually kind of an interesting one. So anyone here who knows guitar, or maybe not even knows guitar, you'll actually may know the names of when an oscillator.
And just for this is a low frequency oscillator. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is the LFO. So when a low frequency oscillator, so LFO, when this can actually affect this one, and this one. And we actually see it here. So we see pitch, which is it's going to affect this knob. It can affect the filter, which is going to affect this knob, and amp, it's going to affect this knob. So
would you say, just to clarify it for folks, that the oscillator is creating the tone that we're listening to? It's a high frequency oscillator that's creating the tone. The low frequency oscillator is going, ooh, like it's moving from one place to another,
it's creating
a value, some sort of wave that's affecting everything else, but it's not creating the tone itself. It's how it's affecting that tone over time. Yeah.
True. We will get into, towards the end of this little presentation, I'll show you how the LFO can affect the tone, but we'll get into that. So you're right. So essentially the LFO is what it's doing is this is actually just, I can do different shapes. So a good one to try actually is sawtooth. So the same shape we got for the sound, sawtooth, but we're going to use an LFO. So we're going to use it relatively slow. So we're going to put LFO, let's say, on the amp. So this is going to be for volume. So if I put this up, so this has positive and negative. So this is where you actually do get a negative depth. What this actually means is the wave going up when it starts or coming down when it starts. So that's what this positive and negative means, because the LFO is a wave of a sort. So if you have the LFO start when you press a note, is it going to go up or down? So for this one, I'm choosing for it to go up. So this is known as tremolo. So we'll do tremolo first. We'll do the basics first. So tremolo, we'll go a little bit faster. So you'd hear this kind of effect. Think James Bond music from the original James Bond opening theme. So that's tremolo. You can get a guitar pedal that does tremolo, does the exact same thing. So there's a lot of guitar pedals right in here. So a lot of people like to put their guitars into this, and essentially they have all the guitar pedals they could ever think of in this synth. The other one you'd think of would be vibrato. So this is something that violinists use, but also you can use on a guitar. So vibrato is where we get the same wave, but with pitch. So now that I've put it to pitch, if we just do a single note, so you can make it quite subtle. We can go quite extreme. So you can go quite extreme as well. So that's vibrato. Then the other one, which is a filter. So this is making the sound brighter and darker in an oscillating way. So we'll bring it down a little bit slower rate. And we've got the filter. So the filter at the moment is set to 4. We're going to set it to halfway. I'll set the filter to halfway. Everything else is fine. That's it. So we play a note. There we go, brighter, darker. So it's oscillating, brighter or darker. The interesting thing is when we change the shape. So this is ramping up. So it's brighter, but then because it's a sawtooth, when it gets to the top, it drops straight back down to 0. But if we come underneath, so anyone who knows Stranger Things in the first season, when the big baddie showed up, this is exactly how they made that sound. So whenever the baddie showed up in the first season of Stranger Things, they had essentially an analog synthesizer doing this, which was this is technically known as this is a sawtooth, where going up is known as a ramp wave. So that's how you can control the filter, brighter or darker, using LFOs and different shapes. Now, if you go to a square wave, those among you may figure out if we do square wave and we put it onto the amp and we go full volume on the amp and I press it, if you can guess what's going to happen when I press a note, it's on off. Because square wave is going to go on or off. It only has 2 values with square wave. So you can actually use this in a way to actually create sequences. So you can actually use an LFO to create a sequence, which is pretty cool because you can actually have on and off. But you can also do that with filter. Brighter, darker. So you can have it brighter or darker. So the LFO is quite creative in how you can do it. This synth has 2 LFOs. It has another LFO down here, which you can actually control via the modulation. So they're actually 2 different LFOs. So when you engage this one, you're actually engaging a different LFO compared to this. But essentially the LFO can control these things. We have a fade in time, which is actually a good one for vibrato. So we'll come back to vibrato, make sure they're all at the bottom, make them go a little bit faster. So the light here flashing tells me how fast it's going. I'll have a fade in time. So just like a violinist, they'll start without having vibrato, but then they will go into a vibrato. So we bring up the pitch. Oh, let's change that to something a violinist would have. So we can have a little bit longer fade time. So the note will start straight, no vibrato, but then after a fade time, which I choose here, it'll start then. And so that's how a violinist would usually bring in vibrato. They won't usually start the note on vibrato. So let's go back to our next slide. Let's keep moving. So 2 oscillators are better than 1. So this one does, and most synthesizers of this kind of ilk that are polyphonic will have two LFOs, hopefully. Some have many more. Noise. Now, this is the bane of, like, how many questions in the first hour were about getting rid of noise in synthesizers. We want to add noise. So noise on this particular synthesizer is very basic. It's a little bit limited. It's okay, but I can't really make any good drum sounds out of it. Well, not really. So it's part of the oscillator. So because you have 3 of these, one of them can be set to noise. You can have the other 2 set to something else, and so you can do percussive stuff. So with noise, it's pretty straightforward what you're going to get. So I'll just make sure everything else is set. Yep, everything else set. It's noise. Now, I do get different kind of colors, but they're not the best colors. It's a bit darker color, that one. And then this one is just, I don't know what it is. It's like static up the top. It's interesting, but it's whatever it is up the top. So it sounds like the wind when we use a filter. So if you think about it, we can actually have, when I press a note, we can actually have the filter come up, and we can actually put the filter into ADSR. So I hit a note, and we actually bring it up. 24 dB. So we can actually make drum sounds, but this is not the best synthesizer to make these kind of snare sounds and hi-hat sounds, but you can. But that's noise, and we kind of use more percussive sounds and sometimes some ambience in the background, because you can actually tune. You can actually put an LFO on the filter for the noise and actually have this kind of ambient wind noise behind your melodic stuff. So it's pretty cool. So we'll put everything back to normal, initialize. That's all normal. That's all normal. Filter open. Back down there. So the next part we want to look at is, it's going to be the last part we look at today. Go ahead, Alex.
No, I was going to say we want to get to some questions here before we.
So this is the last part we're going to do, and we're going to do them both in one. So we're going to get a quick look. So this is a ring modulator and frequency modulator. Now this synthesizer has a very basic ring modulator. It doesn't really have frequency modulation, but there is a way to get to it. So what we can do is, in the oscillator, if we set the oscillator to sine wave, and not all oscillators have this in the actual, we can set them to sine wave. So in tone 1, I turn on ring modulation. These turn orange, tell me I'm in ring modulation. So in 1, we'll just keep it normal. So normal tuning, normal volume, normal everything, not a problem. So if I play a tone, I know that that's going to be the sine wave. And I want to go there, make sure that's there. Turn that off, and turn LFO. And then in 2, we're going to go to sine wave. I'm going to bring the pitch all the way down, but I'm also going to turn the volume down. We're not going to hear tone number 2. We're only going to hear tone number 1. Tone number 1 is definitely going to be full volume. Tone number 2, we're not going to hear. Tone number 2, by this little picture here, tone number 2 is going to modulate tone number 1, but they're both going to be sine waves. So they're both sine waves. So if I play a note now, it's going to be quite quiet. It sounds like an electric piano. So what we can do, we can actually make this. So this is pretty quiet because this synthesizer is not really the best when it comes to. But that is one oscillator modulating the other oscillator like an LFO, but it's actually doing it at audio rates. It's It's actually only doing it 2 octaves lower, about 2.5 octaves lower. But so that's called FM. This is it's a very basic example of FM. So one of the oscillators is modulating the other one, and the other one is actually, and that's how we hear that kind of electric piano sound. It's basically out of this synth, but it does show the principle of ring modulation, which is having one oscillator affect another, and then frequency modulation by having 2 sine waves. All right.
That's awesome. So, great overview. That's really clear. I think it's probably one of the clearer outlines of that I've seen. So really, really well done. John Preto, did you want to add something before we jump to Nick?
Yeah, so Karl just gave my freshman level electronics class in 30 minutes, and this is everything that we did in freshman level electronics. I have a function generator in my garage, and so we had to build the function generator as freshmen. So we square waves, and it was interesting when he was showing the square waves. If you zoom into the top and the bottom of the square waves, you'll see a sinusoidal wave on the top. It's the ringing from the square wave, and we had to calculate those with calculus to see how much ringing we could decrease with an LCC circuitry. This is amazing. The question is it how much of this is artistry versus engineering? It seems overly engineered for an engineer and not so much for a musician.
Well, I'll let maybe Nick answer that to some degree. But Nick, did you want to add a couple things before we jump into the questions?
Ultimately, the kind of art of synthesis generally is, you can have a load of knobs on a synthesizer, but it's the modulation of those knobs which makes it interesting, and what you can route to what. I mean, that's a pretty impossible task to cover in a short presentation. So well done, Karl. To your point, it can be very engineering, but generally one is guided by one's ear. That would be the way I would start. I mean, sometimes when you become a bit more au fait with the synthesis techniques, you can kind of, you have an idea. I'm going to try this patch, and you think, if I plug this into this might happen. And you kind of abstract it to a certain degree. It might sound terrible, but I mean, you're basing your kind of intuit on some of these sort of underlying engineering principles, I suppose, when you're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I love this quote from Man on Fire. It says, "You can be an artist at anything, cooking, whatever it is." He got into something else after that, but anyway. I think that the artistry is always exactly what Nick was talking about, is knowing the science of it is knowing how it actually works. Like if you look at really good high-end cooks, oftentimes they understand the chemistry and the physics of what's happening with the meat or the vegetables or
modernist cuisine. Exactly right.
And so they understand it, and then they know what to pull at. But what the end goal is to create a great meal. And in this case, understanding how all these things work. I definitely worked with folks, and when I first got into using synthesizers for stuff, I had no idea how any of it worked. I just turned the knobs until I liked it. I just kind of play with it. Oh, I like what I look at. But could I reproduce that, or did I have any real leverage in, I want to do something like that, but for this other style? I couldn't do that because I didn't know anything about how it actually was being calculated. And so until I knew that, I was like, oh, I don't really like that, but now I can change it. It's the same way when we look at images, you might take a bunch of pictures that you like, but until you understand what depth of field is, understand how the f-stop affects that, understand how the sensor size affects that, until you understand some of those science, you can't reliably reproduce something, with that. So I think it's a really, really interesting mix. Let's go ahead and jump into the questions.
All right. Vienna Tran from Australia has our first question. What is a suitable hardware and software synthesizer for a beginner?
Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, well, I'm going to put a word in for, it may be a bit beyond beginner, but I think you've got to challenge yourself. You don't want something that you're going to find the end of too quickly, because if you're starting on this journey, you may as well enjoy it for as long as possible with your first purchase. I would put, for hardware, I would maybe consider the Behringer Neutron, which I think not only has a lot of synthesis potential, but it actually sounds pretty good, and that's always a start. You might want something that's beginnery, but you want it to sound pretty good too. So that's what I'd say maybe for hardware. For software, there's a lot of options. You could go, there's loads of free stuff. I mean, really, it's just a question again. Ultimately, if you start off with, if you've got some iOS devices, that might be a good place to start, because then you kind of get your head around it. It'll be a cheap way in. But there's a VCV rack, which is really deep, which is like a virtual modular synthesizer, perhaps not so good for a beginner. There's something called for FM, which is called DexEd, which is like a DX7. So if you like those kind of FM sounds.
It's called Deck what?
DexEd, DEXED. And that's a free one. And that will load old patches from those synthesizers and play them back. And there's something simple called the TAL Noisemaker, which I think is another one that's worth checking out. And that's, again, free. There are lots of free ones out there. So, nothing to lose by trying it out.
Go ahead, Carl.
So I'll start with the software first. I think GarageBand's got Alchemy with basic controls. It doesn't have the full control. The full control will come with Logic. So it also has Alchemy. Alchemy is probably one of the better software synths you'll get that's joined in with. Now, if you can get the education bundle that includes Logic for $2.99, then that's a goer. But start with GarageBand until you pretty much outgrow GarageBand, until you go, I really want to be able to modulate this. And because GarageBand allows you to do simple parameters, doesn't let you do the full thing, then step up to Logic and Alchemy and Logic. That's a good place to start, because there's a lot of videos online about how to teach it, and Apple's own documentation is pretty good about what knob does what as well. As far as hardware, yes, I would agree. I remember the very first office hours I was on with the camera, I held up a Neutron, which is a red one. Alex, that's the red one with the semi-module, the plug on the one side. The other one I'd probably suggest, if you're coming in, would be the Novation Base Station 2. It sounds like an odd one, but the Base Station 2's on like firmware 4, and the firmware 4 means it's really the fourth version of the synth. Novation have done a very good job of it, and that's actually, it's got a very similar layout to this. So what you see is what you get. It's a mono synth. It was meant for bass, but you can do leads and stuff on it as well. But it's essentially, it's kind of similar to this particular synth, but it's all analog, and it sounds great. And Novation are keeping it updated, so they keep on adding new things. I believe they added kind of an FM thing in there as well. So it is pretty cool. But yeah, Novation Base Station would be, and I know you can pick them up cheap secondhand because they've been out for quite a while, but they're pretty cheap, brand new as well. Go ahead, Alex.
And this is the Neutron. so this is the and with some random stuff that I was doing to it. So anyway, really, I have to be careful with it, because if I turn it on, like, I lose hours, because I sit there and just start staring at it and go, and you kind of go off into Never Never Land, which is kind of fun. But I have to be careful of when I turn it on, usually only on the weekends, because otherwise I have things to do. Anyway, it's really, really fun piece of hardware, though. Next question.
Danny Law from Malaysia. What are the common misconceptions about synthesizers, if any, and what makes them different from other keyboards?
Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, well, I think perhaps one of the things is most general keyboards, you switch them on or you hit them, they make a noise. With a synthesizer, there's a very good chance you might turn it on and it won't make a noise, and you won't know why, because you maybe got the settings different and it hasn't got any memories. So I think most synthesizers are different in that it's easy to mess with the front panel settings, like I say, to make either won't make a sound or it will make a sound you don't want it to make and it won't stop. Whereas, regular keyboards usually are more your pianos, organs, mechanicals. So, you hit them and they're kind of percussive instruments. They're very different.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, as Nick said, so, and I think a keyboard would have essentially only presets. It may actually have a filter knob on it. It may, that's essentially After Effects, more of an effect rather than in the actual synthesis, because there won't be any LFO or just a filter. It's more of like an effect like reverb, delay, filter. Right. So they do have those kind of features in there. Same things you do find in some workstations too. So workstations don't have the filters. If you menu dive, that's similar to this, but the filter they usually have on the top panel is more of a, again, reverb, delay, filter. The other misconception people sometimes have is the difference between a workstation and a synthesizer. So the Phantom, the Roland Fantom, for instance, the Roland Fantom has a very powerful synthesizer within it, but it's primarily designed as a workstation. It'd be quite laborious to actually sit there and program that thing as the same way I can program this particular synth, or for instance, let's say the Jupiter or the Juno that's just come out. So they have more knobs per function on the front, a little bit faster to get to, a little bit better for sound creation. But the cool thing about Roland, of course, is you can create a patch on a Jupiter and then export it to the Phantom. So it's the exact same sound. It has the same engine inside, which is pretty, well, most of the same engines inside. But the Phantom is really a workstation that is generally like the trailer music we just heard in the NASA YouTube video. So that trailer music would have been made on like a workstation like this in a software. So using in combination with the hardware and software, you'd create this kind of stuff. Another thing is an arranger keyboard. So an arranger keyboard is usually the keyboard you'd find someone playing at a wedding. So you can have a little bit of drum beat in the background and they play along to it. Arranger keyboards are pretty cool. They have simple synthesizer functions as well, but they can't create the full, putting LFOs in 10 different places, that kind of stuff. So we don't see that. But so the arranger keyboards, workstation keyboards, and then you actually got digital pianos. And digital pianos are pretty straightforward.
Next question.
Vienna Tran in Australia, how has the role of synthesizers in film soundtracks evolved over the past 50 years, and how do you think it will change in the future?
Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I'd like to point out that 50 years ago, I was probably about 6, so I wasn't kind of fully listening, but originally synthesizers were generally used to kind of add atmosphere, so you'd have a spooky sound or a weird sci-fi sound, so it would be more of a feature thing which would indicate otherworldliness or something that was not normal. So electronic music started out as, it was an unusual sound, whereas now soundtracks are largely comprised of synthesizers because they, with things like kind of the CGI and things that we're creating imagery that we have no audio description for. So synthesizers are very useful for making those worlds feel real and organic. And quite often, synthesizers in true synthesis form, they would probably provide, some of the textures and the sounds that would normally you wouldn't need to hear, because if you were listening onto a TV in the 50s, it would have had zero frequency response, whereas now you maybe you're listening to it on a huge system where you want the sub bass to rattle the windows and whatnot. So it's very, very different. And also they emulate orchestras and all sorts of things. So they've made the composition of film scores much more democratized and much more available and much more varied, I guess.
You go ahead, Karl.
Yeah, so for a lot of people, synthesizers music in films, Vangelis comes to mind. So you've got Chariots of Fire, Blade Runner. You've also got Wendy Carlos going back, so The Shining, her, Switched on Bach, which came out in the late 60s. And then throughout the 70s, it was used for more of effect. I think the Byrds, Alfred Hitchcock used synthesizers, essentially electronic sounds, which were tonal, but some people may consider them atonal, but he used them for storytelling, not necessarily as part of the score. They would technically be more part of the sound design than part of the score. And then as you go on through the 80s, once it became popular and became quite fashionable, then, pretty much all the 80s and half the 90s, we can actually just hear a synth sound and go, oh, that reminds me of that song or that movie, And then I think that when we got to around the year 2000, when Pro Tools came out and we actually had software, essentially software packs, where we could actually have an orchestra in a computer. They technically are synthesizers, even though there's some of them are sample-based, some of them are modeled, but essentially they have taken off, and nearly all temp tracks and all trailers are actually done with those kind of music, and it's only when you get to the feature film, if they've got enough money, they'll actually come in. So Star Wars: The Clone Wars is all synthesizers, except for like a couple of episodes where the conductor himself paid for an orchestra in Prague. So he flew to Prague, paid for an orchestra, and actually had a few episodes where he goes, I really want this to be an orchestra, not out of the computer. So there were a few episodes of The Clone Wars made under George Lucas, where it was a real orchestra, but all the rest of the music that George had made for that was in the computer, in the box. It was synthesizers via samples or modeling.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, just back through history, the theremin was patented in 1928. So at the very dawn of the film industry, and it was used in horror films. Bernard Herrmann used it in some of his tracks. Also, it was an all-electronic score for the movie Forbidden Planet in the 50s. So, synthesizers have been used in motion pictures, for more than 50 years. And like Nick and Karl were saying, these days they've evolved to the point with sampling synthesizers that no longer, much to the chagrin of all the union musicians out there, you can do a full orchestral soundtrack just off of a decent Yamaha synthesizer in one pass even. It's that and the ability of a digital workstation. So all the temp tracks, all the preview tracks that the composer and the arranger create are all done on the synthesizer to work out the orchestrations. And then eventually, if they have enough money, they'll bring in an orchestra and recreate those with a full orchestra. So the synth is used as a substitute for the orchestra nowadays rather than just the creepy sci-fi sounds. Also, Coppola used synthesizers. They come into a lot of place for sound effects. I used them a lot on the movie Honey, I Blew Up the Kids, the sequel to Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. I created a lot of sounds for that movie with synthesizer and a sampling synthesizer. And all the helicopters and Apocalypse Now, those are all synthesizers.
Yeah, the one of the apps that I've just started to play with, and it's really deep, so I'm still getting my head around it. It's called Phase Plant. And Phase Plant 2.0 I've been playing with, and it's really deep. But if you look at people showing examples, sound designers showing examples, it is insane what they're building with that synthesizer. But it's just layering all of these things up on top of each other. It's a piece of software to play with, and we're trying to schedule them to come on to show it, because I can't produce what I'm hearing from their experts yet, but it's a pretty amazing app. Next question.
Josh Kaufman from Pittsburgh, PA. What is the benefit of Aftertouch integrated into a synth? How might you cope when not available? What styles benefit from polyphonic Aftertouch versus single channel?
So many questions. Go ahead, Karl.
So this particular synth doesn't have Aftertouch, it has D-Beam. So D-Beam was an interesting idea that Roland did. They still do, I guess, because this synth is still sold brand new. D-Beam is quite good because it actually allows you to control parameters like that you can't control any other way. So you can actually just control any knob. So you hit a sign, you touch a knob, and a lot of synths have this, but the D-Beam has that function. So this particular, nearly all my other synths do, well, not most of my other polyphonic synths do have Aftertouch. So Aftertouch is if you press hard on the buttons, essentially the key itself goes down. That's your velocity. And then when you press harder, it's actually pressing into a pad, and that pad is like a pressure pad. And that can actually take numbers from 0 to 127 or 0 to 150, 255, and essentially you can assign that to a parameter. So you can open up the filter, you can change the volume, those kind of things. You can actually assign it to multiple parameters, so you can have Aftertouch affect multiple things at the same time at different levels. So it can get quite complicated. So Aftertouch is quite good, especially for making something bright. So the most common one is when you press down the Aftertouch, it opens up the filter, so it makes it sound brighter. Or opposite, when you press down, it makes it sound darker. So generally, sometimes people use it for that with volume as well. Polyphonic Aftertouch just means that each note has its own value for Aftertouch, whereas channel Aftertouch or standard Aftertouch would be, doesn't matter how many notes you're holding, it's just one value of Aftertouch. So essentially, think of it as like a bar that you're pressing down on, whereas each note is a pad. So Vangelis used Aftertouch quite brilliantly in Chariots of Fire and in Blade Runner and in 1492, which he did in the early 90s, because he had these brass sounds, and just like in an orchestra, you'd actually have, trumpets actually jump up a bit higher or trombones hit a bit higher. So essentially when he's doing a chord of brass, he's playing essentially like a tuba, a trumpet, and let's say a trombone. And so if he wants the trumpets to come out further, he'll actually put down his little pinky, which would be the highest brass note, press it down a bit harder, and they become brighter. And that's like the trumpet's getting a little bit brighter, where the other one's not. So that's where polyphonic is kind of good. You can do so many other creative things, but that's just one example of how Vangelis used it. The other things, if you don't have it, expression pedals. So you can use expression pedals, and if you ever watch Vangelis later in life, he had under his custom-made synth, he had like, probably 10 pedals, and those 10 pedals were doing the same job as Aftertouch. He had Aftertouch on his keyboard, but he wanted even more expression. So he even wanted more control, more than his 10 fingers could give him. So he had all these pedals underneath it. He could play the pedals and have them like half down and all the way down, and that would change parameters depending on what he wanted. So you can use pedals to get away with what Aftertouch does as well.
Next question.
Vienna Tran from Australia. Why don't some software synthesizers have presets?
Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I was trying to think of ones that don't, and I couldn't actually think of any software synthesizers that don't have presets. But I had a chat with Urs Heckman, who is one of the developers or the proprietor of Yuhi Software, who is a programmer, and we talked about this, and they thought it was kind of sometimes there's this kind of two schools of thought. You know, if you use a synthesizer, you should be in the moment and just kind of do what you need to do, and then, you know, come back to it and it'll be something else next time. That's very much what happens with modular. It's very hard to do presets with that. But with software, people kind of expect just to be able to dial up presets, and perhaps they don't program very hard. And he was thinking that maybe he should release a special version that was maybe cheaper, that you couldn't save anything on. The only way you could do it is to record it and then you were done. But obviously that's not much good if you're a media composer and your cue has just been submitted on Monday morning, and then you get a call on Monday lunchtime saying, oh, I need you to change this, and you haven't got the sound anymore. So, you know, exactly. It depends what suits your...
Take a lot of photos.
Yeah, exactly. Well, of software, it's a bit weird, isn't it? But yeah, I suppose screenshots, I guess you could. But I can't think of any. I can't think of any without.
I know I have a collection somewhere back in the 90s when I was first getting started. There's a lot of pictures of my synthesizer because I was like, I don't know how to get back here. So I would just take pictures of the knobs to make sure that I knew, like, I could get at least into the ballpark, and it wouldn't capture all the things that were happening, but at least like, oh, here's some notes to get me to some breadcrumbs is what I used to call them, breadcrumb pictures. Go ahead, Courtney.
And a lot of the times with an analog synth, a performance involves turning the knob during a note. So it involves a lot of expression that really can't be contained in a preset unless you program an ADSR or an envelope generator to do that at precisely the right moment, or have it evolve in that sound at a certain point that adds a certain emotion to the soundtrack. So that's why you don't see a lot of presets. But as far as the basic presets to achieve a certain sound or effect, you know, there are lots of saving of presets. And my next question has to do with that. So go ahead, we'll get to that in a minute.
So Nick did mention VCV. So this is one where you have to put your modules together and make a patch. You can save your patch, but it doesn't necessarily come with presets for each of the modules. So that's kind of one scenario where that would happen in software. Cherry Audio has a very similar thing to VCV, where you can put the modules together, but you actually have to hook them up. Once you've hooked them up, you can save this setup, and it saves, but out of the box, there's nothing there. I'll speak to the hardware side. So let's say the Poly D, for instance. So there's a popular synth that doesn't, or the Neutron is another one. So these don't have presets in them. And the reason why is because they're fully analog. So they're not even digital potentiometers, which I do have in one of my synths. I do have an analog synth that does have digital potentiometers, which means you can actually have presets, and you can save your patches. But let's say the Poly D, you're actually adjusting analog potentiometers, and so unless you get those potentiometers, those knobs, back to where they were, you're not going to get the same sound again. So as Alex said, he's going to take a photo and sweat over it to try to get that same sound. And as Nick said before, if you're a composer and you actually need to, you'll create the sound, and then you put a piece of paper over that synthesizer saying, do not touch, do not clean, you know, until that project is finished. And this happens for a lot of composers. And funnily enough, it actually happened on Stranger Things in the first season. They did an atonal kind of sequence using a sequencer. So you can actually, and it was an atonal sequence for something in the upside down. And the producer liked it so much they couldn't actually touch that sequencer for a year. So that they had to get tape and put over that sequencer. This is a modular sequencer.
Like just buy another one.
Because they would never get that because it's atonal. Yeah, it's atonal.
Right, yeah, exactly. Go ahead. Next question.
And it's Courtney Goodens from Hollywood. Karl, what do you think of the Analog Model Synths plugins like the Arturia Moog Modulator 5?
We'll start with Karl and then Nick.
So I don't actually use anything because I own many analog synths. So I actually don't feel a need to go over to Arturia and play with them because half the Arturias that are there I own. I own digital modeling synths, and as far as my Jupiter X and that kind of stuff, we're actually modeling. And I own all the boutiques. So these are the ACB. This is the closest you'll pretty much get to analog without being analog. But the other section, I don't really use any of the boutique stuff. That's, you know, I've got the Roland Cloud, but I don't really use it there. I use the Roland Cloud for other stuff that I don't have. But the interesting thing is with these, it is great to actually get sounds if you're doing a production. So if you're actually a media composer who's working for a living, then these software packs make a lot of sense. That's not me. I don't make a living from this, so it's more of a hobby. So I actually like doing the manual, you know, playing with the analog potentiometers and finding that sweet spot, which is a little bit tricky to do with software sometimes. You can have MIDI controllers, so you can actually have the knobs in front of you. So the synth that I'll be playing on today can actually work a software synth, so I can actually use the knobs to program a software synth. But it's going to be in steps of 127 or 256. You know, so my Roland goes up to over 1,000, so it has a 10-bit per knob, and then the cross actually has over 10,000 values, so that'd be pretty high. That's going to be like 16-bit or something.
And to be specific, this Arturia is a keyboard, but it has a software
so
synthesizer that you can...
because they're a hardware software company, they're able to do this kind of stuff where they can link it, and so does Roland. Roland has similar things where you can actually use any Roland synth to control another Roland synth, software synth essentially. So this is kind of not unheard of, but for me, the Arturia, I don't subscribe to the Arturia stuff, so I don't have any Arturia stuff. The Roland Cloud is kind of the only software synth outside of Logic that I use regularly, but that's because, once you've got some pretty big hardware synths that are digital as well as analog as well as hybrid, so I've got some hybrids as well which have digital oscillators and all the rest is analog, then you kind of spoiled for choice in a way, whereas software mouse and keyboard is probably the least fun way for me personally to control a synthesizer.
It's funny. It's why someone asked why I have a bunch of pieces of hardware that I don't use as much as I should, but there's something organic about playing with it that when you can do the same thing in software, but it's like a little mouse thing, and it doesn't feel as organic. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much these days most model synths are pretty good. There was a period, where it was all a bit off, but the computing power and the algorithms and the manufacturers have kind of pretty much nailed most of the big ones anyway, certainly Arturia. And Arturia have recently, they re-released a lot of their V collection. I'm not sure if they've released this one, but like, for instance, they redid the Prophet, and they've completely rewritten the engine to sort of take advantage of the new DSP algorithms and smarts that are now available, and the CPU power. So to be honest, I mean, it would be fine. It's just... It's not going to, like Alex says, you're not going to get the same feeling playing with it because you're playing with something on screen, unless you are a kind of screen and a mouse person, because you may be media composer and you have to, because you can't afford to use your analogs in deadline situations. You do it more for fun and performance. Then, yeah, I don't see any problem with any of those, to be honest.
Good, Courtney.
I thought it might be a good way to teach synthesis, since the Moog Modular 5 was like the one that Walter Carlos or Wendy Carlos used on switched on Bach, and it's been used by Rick Wakeman, a lot of famous people, and it emulates that entire setup, which is, that's a Modular 5 there, so it's the Moog patching system. So it teaches you the stuff that Karl just ran through with just hit the buttons and the presets of his analog synth by actually running the patches. So it takes skeuomorphism to the ultimate, and it emulates you get the same number of oscillators, the same number of filters, and you have to patch everything the way you did on the Modular 5, and it generates the sounds and lets you control it the same way you would on an actual analog synth. So it becomes a good teaching tool, I think, to teach synthesis if you don't have access to an actual Modular 5.
Absolutely. Next question.
David Brady, New York, New York. A friend of mine has a vintage 1977 Arp Avatar Guitar Synth. I've seen mods that add MIDI to the device. Should we try this to bring this dinosaur into the 21st century, or leave it to the Neoprotozoic Era? And by the way, that's a great name for a classic synthesizer, Neoprotozoic.
Sounds like a good band. Go ahead, Karl.
So you can do a MIDI mod, or you can just get a box on the outside that does the mod for you. So I've got a couple of these boxes. So they take MIDI in, or even Bluetooth MIDI in, and USB MIDI in, and then output CV. So the Arturia, the KeyStep Pro, that actually has MIDI in, USB, all that kind of stuff, and actually does multiple channels of CV out. So CV out is a way to control voltage, and you can control pitch, you can control on-off, which is gate, so note on, note off, and you can control modulation. So this is kind of what Alex showed the Neutron before. So that patch panel on the right-hand side of that, that's all CV. So you can actually get little boxes that just do the CV conversion for you. So the funny thing is, Alex could actually use that box to do the exact same thing, because Alex has MIDI on one side of that box. You can actually put MIDI in, and then out of that box, he could send CV out to the Avatar. So he can actually use that synth as a in-between, but you can simply mod. Yeah, so you can put, that's it. You can put, so in the back you can put it in, but you can get very small modules that may be, probably 4 inches square, that can go inside the Avatar, and they simply wire up with a CV, and there is quite an easily mod, and you can find a lot of YouTube videos that show you how to do it, or you can have a box externally. They are good fun because it allows your computer to control it. So you can have your computer being a sequencer, and you play in time with your guitar on it, and you can control it in time. It's pretty cool.
Next question.
Albie Lopez in San Antonio, Texas. Any recommendations for entry-level synths to play stems and beats? Was looking at the Akai MK3 Mini Play.
Go ahead, Nick.
I'm not sure. I don't quite understand the question, because playing stems and beats would be a sort of quite a specific thing. That might be a controller that you could use for that. I think the thing is trying to figure out what it is you're trying to play. I would maybe look at the Novation Circuit Mark II, because you get two synthesizers and 4 sample tracks, which you can use for either drum sounds or quite large chunks of sample memory. So you could actually play. I did a demo with it where I put entire phrases and stems, which are sort of pre-mixed, that I played along. So if that's what I understand you mean, then maybe something else. But if you're looking something controller computer, I mean, a computer can play back all of that stuff. And yeah, sure, the Akai would probably work fine for that. But I don't think it does it in a standalone format on its own.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so as Nick said, so the Novation circuit, and there's a rhythm as well. So they've got these interesting, so they're kind of like, they've got pads, but they've also got some control at the top. So it's kind of like a synthesizer at the top. Novation is a good one. So Roland also have their compact series they just released. So there's a compact series that does chords, essentially. There's a compact series that does vocoding, singing, voice modulation, and there's a compact series that does, these are around $250 US each, that does rhythm. So it's essentially, it's a 808 in there, and it's also a 303, so into one box. So these essentially, they've taken their bigger products, more expensive products, and squished out all the parts that people want to use, and you can link all 3 of them up together, and or just buy one of them. But the chord one is quite interesting. So the chord one allows you, if you don't have too much of a musical background, you can just use the automated chord function in it and just find one you like, so it has chord patterns, and then you get that chord pattern going, and then you can either play against it yourself or sing against it. So that's a kind of a jam function where you can get beats and kind of those kind of stems, as you say, which is the Roland compact series they have at the moment.
Next question.
Robert Shoji from Los Angeles, California. Could Nick talk a bit about Goldfrapp's synth sound?
Go ahead, Nick.
That's a big question. Which one? The thing about Goldfrapp is Will Gregory, who is the kind of a lot of the music behind it. He has an enormous collection of synthesizers, and quite often the Goldfrapp stuff is put together from lots and lots and lots and lots of multi-tracking and just kind of jams and snippets and phrases and all kinds of things. So it depends on what they're using at the time. A lot of it is played, and it originates from a fantastic collection of analog synths, both polyphonic and monophonic, that actually Will said I can go up and do some videos in his garage when at some point, which I will, but it's kind of hard to know. I mean, if you can name a specific track, well, I'll make some
hour on that one.
I'll make some videos, and that's the idea. I've just got to find the time to get up there and do it. But because we did a series on Sonic State called 5 Minutes With, and just a synth, 5 minutes with this. Well, this is kind of
we can give you an hour with, like a second hour. We'll from Roll Trap. Just saying.
But yeah, I mean, thank you. But there are many, 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 many synths, because we're talking 6 or 7 albums now, and they've all got synths on them. I mean, some of the early ones would have had MS-20, Korg 700S, some of the famous ones for Strict Machine and Train. There was also the Polyvox, which was used a lot. Jupiter 6. I mean, there's a whole bunch of synths there, really. I mean, it's just which one.
That's great. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael in with a question. What niche does the ASM Hydrasynth fill in comparison to the Novation Peak and other subtractive synths?
Go ahead, Nick.
Well, the thing about the Hydrasynth is it is ultimately digital. I mean, it's trying to say, it sounds quite analog, and it can sound, and the Peak is more modeled on analog. There is analog filters, but the oscillators are still FPGA, so there's sort of digital. The thing about the Hydrasynth is what makes it really unique is we've got 8-position wavetables, so you can really sequence up lots of different wave states and morph between them. But the big one, I think, is the mutators, which I've only just begun to scratch the surface with. I did a video with Glenn, who's one of the original designers, and he showed me how each mutator, you can have an input and output, and the thing in the middle does all kinds of stuff. There are FM mutators, there are pulse width mutators. It's way beyond most people's grasp of synthesis. including mine in many ways, because it's so deep. And that's what makes, and I think the thing about the Hydrasynth, it is an incredibly deep instrument. And not only that, but it's also, because we've got polyphonic aftertouch and we've got this ribbon strip, certainly on the regular and the deluxe versions, the expression that you get is perhaps more at your fingertips than with, say, the Peak. The Peak is a great synthesizer, and I'm not saying it's any less. It's just, it's not as deep, I would say.
Good, Karl.
Yeah, so as Nick said, the Peak is more of an analog synth with FPGA oscillators and FPGA effects section. So it's more of an analog beast. So the mutators in the Hydrasynth are the thing that make it very, very deep. The Hydrasynth, when it first came out, I think people went straight to the very first version, the original version, not the desktop version. It was like, oh, it's got polyphonic aftertouch. Everyone went straight to that. But as people owned it, they sat with it, and they got to those mutators and the matrices. So the matrix you can actually make on that is ridiculous. It's like, it's so deep that you can actually have, so you can actually have this affect that, then it'll affect that. Then you can have one mutator affect another mutator, and then feed back into itself. So you can do kind of any patching you really want, you can think of. And because the guys at ASM are actually keeping the firmware up to date, so pretty much any good idea that comes along, they'll put it into the next firmware build that will come out, every 6 months or whatever. And hopefully they've got more instruments coming, because at the moment they've got essentially one instrument that comes in 4 flavors, size and in a way, and there's 16 voices on the larger deluxe versus the 8 voices on the regular, the mini, and the desktop. But they all have polyphonic via some form, so the desktop has it via the pads. And but the other thing that the Hydrasynths can be used for with the Peak, if you want to get both, the Peak is polyphonic aftertouch capable. So you can take a Hydrasynth, plug it into your Peak, and get polyphonic Peak. So that's fun.
Next question.
Next question from Kenny Hampton in Greenville, Illinois. Vintage synths' internal temps affect the sounds. Is this true with modern synths with varying input voltages?
Good, Karl.
100% yes. So Alex has the Neutron. I know Alex has the Poly D as well. So 30 minutes. So pretty much you have to turn them on for 30 minutes for them to get stable. People do measure them. You can actually do a graph. You actually just play an A note and see what it changes over time and plot that graph. But I have a Jupiter X. Now the Jupiter X has gone bonkers. It's fully digital, but it has a thermostat in it. What that means is I can actually tell it to be, hey, I've turned this on, and it will take 30 minutes for this digital synth to tune. But I can make it go to 10 minutes. I can make it go to 10 seconds if I want. So I can actually change it. Or I can turn that feature completely off. But also, I've got aging in there as well. So in the Jupiter X, I can say, I want this synth to be 40 years old. So 40 years old synth, which is the same age as the Jupiter was back in 1981, I can play that, and it will be out of tune, a little bit out of tune, a little bit wobbly. And all the voices will be a little bit different to each other. And then you can go, oh, maybe that's a bit too much. Maybe I just want it 10 years old. And I just want the temperature range to be a little bit less. So you do get these really analog, really interesting when you're playing different pads on top of each other, because they just wobble about. There's movement, but it's just natural movement. It's no modulation you're doing. It's just the synth itself. And so no two vintage analog synths ever sound alike. That's true. And you can get that the same with the modern stuff as well. But yes, definitely vintage, modern analogs. Some modern analogs are a little bit more stable. They get there faster. So I know the Moog One will get there a little bit faster than some of the Behringer stuff, but I kind of like the Behringer stuff taking half an hour. It means you can get some pretty funky stuff in the first 10 minutes.
Last question for the hour.
Last question from Douglas Carmichael, and I might need a little help with the pronunciation here. Currently, I have an Elektron Analog Four, Analog Rhythm, and a Digitone. Since purchasing a Roland Fantom-06 as my main synth, I'm only using the Digitone as an auxiliary sound source. Would I lose much going to the syntactic from the Four and Rytm?
Good, Karl.
You would get a different flavor. It's not going to be the same, but it's up for your creativity. So it depends on where you're creatively feeling. One synth can give you that another one can't. Watch videos of people who own it before you buy it. Find out if how they're using it matches what you want to do, not necessarily what type of features or you think it's going to go well with this. It's more about what can you create with it. So we kind of talk about the same thing here on Office Hours. Another way to create it is which camera is best, for what situation, which microphone is best. It depends what you want to do. So I find that, I like the Behringer stuff, I like the Roland stuff. And I find that these two mix kind of come together. One's very modern, very digital, has a lot of features. Behringer has some clones of older synths and has some modern stuff like the Neutron and the Deep Mind. And there's enough in there. And I have all the boutiques as well, which gives me the 808 and the 909 and all that stuff. So I have enough modern and new stuff that I can pretty much go any creative way I want. But I don't feel like I need to go out and buy extra stuff just because I'm like, oh, I'm not getting. If you read the manual, that's the first thing I suggest. Read the manual for the stuff you've got. You'll find out there's some features in there that you probably didn't know, and watch more videos on not necessarily YouTubers saying unboxing. So the unboxing ones, like they've had it for 4 minutes. That's not good. You want to find people who have had it for a year. You want to find out people who have created songs with it, and you want to find those people. So find videos where people say 1 year review. Just put that in 1 year review and put your product you want. That's kind of the best way to do it. Or jams. So Nick does Friday jams. What he does, he'll take these synths that he's reviewing, but he's lived with them for a couple of months, and he just does a jam with them. He just puts 2 or 3 synths from different manufacturers together and sees how they work and just has a jam on Fridays. And so that's another way. So if you take a look at Nick's jams, there's a lot of creativity in those jams that you may not think about from just a synth by itself. But when you put it with something else, which is very basic, or maybe even just some software from a computer controlling it, you get quite a lot of expression.
And Nick, are you doing these jams live?
Well, I do them. I don't stream them live, but I do them sort of generally off the cuff. What I do is I record all the ISOs because I can't switch the camera and perform at the same time, and then I just make the cuts afterwards. So it could be live.
You know, we could switch the cameras for you.
Well, that's very true. Yeah. Well, I'll think about it.
We have the
well, I'm using vMix here, so I could easily open up the API to you. It'd be easy peasy. Yeah. So maybe I'll have to think about that. It could be possible.
Yeah. What were you going to say about the question?
Well, I would say, to be honest, if you've got all of those electrons, I'm surprised you've got any time to think about being creative because they take a lot of time to work with. I guess the Digitone and the Digitact, that's the Swedish pronunciation. I'm sorry to correct you there, but Mitchell. But it's so Digitone, Digitact, and Syntact. The Syntact is kind of a bit of a misnomer because it's actually a 12-channel drum machine. So I think the question was, would I lose much going from to a Syntact from the Four and the Rytm? Rytm is more analog. There is some digital there, and the Analog Four is a lovely sounding instrument. I guess, if you want to play up to 4-note chords with lovely effects on them, then you're not going to get that out of the Syntact.
That's great. What a great hour. So thank you so much to Karl and Nick, Courtney, John. We had a lot of people here who that was a really geeky hour. Really enjoyed it. So we're hoping to do this once a month where we just kind of come together. This was a very basic introduction. Karl's also working on these. We're going to have some little labs.
Workshops in after hours.
Yeah, workshops and after hours. So stay tuned for those coming up. But I really, I just find synths to be amazing and fun. And so we're going to keep on trying to kind of add it and slowly kind of build a group of people that are all trading notes and working together on it. It always takes a little bit of time, but I think that what we're going to find is people start coming out of the woodwork of, I use one of these and I use one of these. We're already seeing some folks. And so we're going to stick with it and do it once a month. And what a great kickoff. So just really fantastic work, Karl and Nick. Thanks so much for coming and joining us here. And Courtney, great for I always know that you do it, and then you're like, well, then I created all this stuff for and I was like, oh yeah, he knows a lot of those things too. So anyway, really, really great work. Thanks to all the panelists. Can't do this without you. And thank you to the producers. Lots of great questions. Really, really kind of drove this. It starts off geeky with Karl, and then it just went way off into geekland. And so really, really thanks to the producers for all the great questions, and thanks to the great team. I was talking to someone else about this somewhere else, and I was like, this show kind of takes like 30 people, 20 or 30 people to turn on every morning. It's kind of a crazy thing. And so there's just an incredible crew in the back end. If you're interested in joining and learning how we do office hours, of course, in the link that goes out every morning, there is a place that you can sign up and say, well, I want to give it a shot. I want to learn how these different pieces work. So definitely check that out. All right. And now we're going to jump into after hours. Here we go. I just want to spend the rest of the day playing with my new drum. Just want to go play with things. I can't. I have to go back to work. Dagnabbit. I got to get a job where I get paid to use the synthesizer.
So we need some spooky theremin sounds.
Oh, yeah. We need to bring someone on to do it there. But yeah, I think that'd be a good second
I'll just send Clavier out.
Mitchell, you have to whisper.
Oh, sorry.
We know that you can whisper. We know you're just being difficult. We heard it.
Once a year.